Welcome, everyone. I'm John Price of America's Market Intelligence, and it's my pleasure to both moderate and act as a panelist today in what is a unique showcase of a webinar that we've recently put together on the Mexico investment risk panorama today, as Mexico goes through a challenging transition of political power and therefore a new set of economic priorities of the next government under Claudia Sheinbaum. We are calling it a masterclass for two reasons. Number one is this is 3 hours in length. There will in fact be 3 separate chapters, each encompassing 1 hour. The first will be on political and economic risks in Mexico. The second will look at operational risks, and the third will look at security risks. And with each chapter, towards the end of that, we will have a Q&A time of about 10 minutes to answer your questions. And then we're hoping to incorporate about a 5-minute break at the end of the first and second chapters so you can attend to urgent emails or what have you. I want to point out that there is at the bottom of your screen, a Q&A button. That's where you can post your questions. You can post them at any point in time. We will categorize them as falling into one of the 3 chapters, and we will address them in the corresponding chapter, led by the panelist who's handling each chapter. And there's also a chat mode, but we want you to use the Q&A mode if you can, please, to post your questions. I want to point out that this is also a masterclass because it's so long in duration and really digging into the weeds, and therefore obliged us to invest considerable resources in putting this information together. We are charging a fee. I believe it's $95. We are hopeful that that $95 will work out to be a useful investment for each and every of you who are in the audience, that you will find some morsel of insight that helps you make an important decision about your Mexican operations. That's what we're here to help you advise on. We also want to point out that that we will be circulating both the recording of this once it's edited, as well as all the materials that you will be seeing here in PowerPoint form. So you'll receive that. And that's important because I know some of you can't sit through the entire 3 hours. And likewise, you might want to share with your colleagues this information. So rest assured, you'll receive that in about 3 business days after we finish today. So with that, let's move forward. And let me briefly explain, this is a legal notice to any of there are several of you who are lawyers in the audience today, so please take note of this. And then on the next slide, I'm going to tell you just very briefly a little bit about what we do at AMI. We have been around for a little over 30 years, started in Mexico, and eventually expanded to cover all of Latin America. And we're in the business of helping our customers make important decisions. Decisions around market entry, around acquisition, around partnering, decisions around how they're going to interact with the competition, decisions around what products to launch and when. All of these decisions require things like market research, competitive intelligence, and understanding the political and economic environment. Those are the kinds of engagements that we work on every day with our clients, and we're happy to work with you guys should you have that need. One other thing on the next slide, I want to point out that we are fairly experienced at making customized presentations in front of our corporate clients. Typically, and it's often this time of year, our clients are in planning mode. They're trying to figure out where they're going to allocate resources next year, which countries are going to focus on, which lines of businesses they're going to focus on, what are the greatest risks they face, and what measures they need to take. And often those decisions are made through a discussion process in an annual planning meeting whereby country managers and C-suite people all gather together, often in a place like Miami, to hash this out over 3 days. And we'll often be invited in on day 1 to provide our view of where the region's going. And this can be useful, objective third-party input that helps you guys come to a quick consensus on these internal decisions. So we welcome that opportunity as well. And let's move forward. I am very pleased to share this webinar with three extraordinary professionals, starting with my colleague of many years, Diego Rodriguez, who runs our logistics practice and our industrial practice. And he will be leading us in the analysis of operational risk in Chapter 2. I'm pleased to invite Alex Gonzalez, who I recently met about 6 months ago and was just very taken aback by his newsletter, The Mexico Political Economist, and by his views on Mexico, which are, as you will see, are nuanced and well-informed. And he's going to be sharing with me the first chapter, which delves into political and economic risk. And I want to make special tribute to Chris Dalby, whose idea this masterclass spawned from. Chris approached us. First of all, I came across Chris, I guess, around the same time as Alex, about 6 months ago. Both of these gentlemen were featured in a podcast where I interviewed them. And Chris suggested this idea of a masterclass. He was doing something similar with the governments of Holland and Belgium around the issue of Mexico. And he came up with this idea, and we brainstormed together and came up with this masterclass. So special thanks to Chris, who will be leading us through the third chapter, security risk, which will start at the third hour of the day. So with that, let's move forward. Now, the first thing we want to ask, and those of you who have attended our webinars are familiar with this, we want to ask you what you consider for your business the three most important risks out of a list of 10. So you have to sort of scroll down to see all 10. So from the top, it's political interference, then U.S. protectionism that disrupts U.S.-Mexico trade. Third is cargo theft. Fourth is lack of reliable electricity and or water. Next is cybersecurity, government bureaucracy, higher taxes, extortion, Mexico economic slowdown, and currency risk. So please go ahead and choose 1 to 3 of those risks that you feel are most pertinent to your business. And we'll give you, about a third of you have responded. So if you wouldn't mind, as many of you as responding as possible, we'd appreciate it. This is useful feedback because I think you'll find it's useful also to yourselves, but it's certainly useful to us. We'll hang on a few more seconds while the rest of you respond. Okay, there's certainly, now this is not a representative sample. There's only 12 of you, but certainly political interference tops the list. Economic slowdown is, and U.S. protectionism are in second place. And then extortion and currency risk come next, followed by lack of reliability electricity. Now, obviously, this is going to somewhat reflect the nature of the business that you're in, as well as possibly even the position that you hold in that business. So let's go ahead and end the poll, and you'll see the results here. Very interesting. Okay, that very much aligns with certainly the conversations that I've held with many companies over the last couple of months, as the risk of political transition has become very top of mind to people. So let's move forward. And as I mentioned, the first chapter will be on the political and economic risks. And I'd like to invite Alex Gonzalez Omarod to lead us in a discussion of what's built up to this, the AMLO years, and where we find ourselves at the beginning of the Scheinbaum sexennium. Over to you, Alex.
Thank you, John. Good morning, esteemed colleagues. Well, fascinating insights already, because clearly the politics of Mexico is now front and center in people's minds. I don't know if we can jump to the next slide and we can dive right in, because one of the things I've realized talking to business people in Mexico and abroad about Mexico is that people are very worried about things they probably shouldn't be too worried about, and vice versa. They're not worried enough about other things that they probably should keep in mind. But let's go back a bit. Let's talk about Andrés Manuel López Obrador, because that's probably the reason we're all here. He is by far the most transformative president, at least since Carlos Salinas de Gortari, if not previously. Why is this? It's because he's completely reconfigured Mexico's political system. He helpfully creates easy sort of quips for us to understand where he's coming from, right? He hates neoliberalism, which is his vision of this sort of elitist, sometimes corrupt political elite that wanted free markets. That's over. It's a lot more state-driven development and state interventionism and centralized power under him. At his beck and call is the Morena Party, which started off as a movement when he was in the political wilderness about 10 years ago. And he turned it into a political party in 2014, making it today by far the biggest party probably in the Americas. And it's just because the BJP and the Chinese Communist Party are around, not in the world, but it's millions of people who are members and tens of millions of people, 36 million people who voted in the previous election for this party. Obviously, Claudia Sheinbaum was on the ballot, but really read between the letters, and it's Andrés Manuel López Obrador, AMLO, who they were really voting for. So suddenly we've got a conundrum before us. We've got to chuck out Mexican political system textbooks, and we've got to dust off our political theory books, because one of the biggest things that has changed in the past couple of months since the election is the complete takeover of Mexican politics by Morena, by at least the ideology of López Obrador. So that's something we want to dive into over the past 6 years. What does an Obradorismo government mean? So let's jump into the next slide. So why did he win so thumpingly? Obviously, there's lots of factors, but I'd argue the biggest one by far is redistribution. Mexico has done pretty badly in terms of its economic growth. People will blame COVID, and that's certainly a big reason why. There's other reasons John will go into. But to me, what's really important is almost a vindication, at least in the short term, of what AMLO argued over the past 20 to 30 years, which is the previous Mexican political economic system was very geared towards exports, was very geared towards growth on the basis of free markets and trade treaties. And with free markets, it's up to companies to pay people what they want. This ended up in Mexico being a very low income country for certain parts of its population. In comes AMLO, and suddenly you've got an interesting form of redistribution. On one side, you've got a lot of handouts going out, thousands of pesos a month for certain demographics, students, old people, rural farmers. And this boosted internal consumption in a very interesting way, because suddenly you've got people consuming in Mexico. It was a very abandoned, I'd say, idea that Mexicans themselves could drive the Mexican economy. Remember, this is an export-driven economy for the past 30-ish years. This, coupled with an increase, basically doubling, of the minimum wage, even more on the Mexican border, which has special rates, drove Mexico's economy even further. This is really interesting because we've all been hearing and talking about nearshoring, but arguably it hasn't really taken off, because with this narrative, with AMLO's sort of adversarial narrative against business, against the United States sometimes, investment has been a bit iffy. We've seen how it goes up and down, but really a lot of it, 90% of it, has been reinvestment. What does that mean? Briefly, it's basically companies who are already in Mexico reinvesting in the country. A really key one here is Walmart. They've just announced they're investing about $500 million in an extension of their network in the southeast of Mexico, very much in line with AMLO's preferred development strategy, which is prioritizing the South, which is underdeveloped. The state drives this development, and economics and trade and investment is basically conceived of as a driver of human development and not in of itself an interesting proposition. And so I just want to outline very briefly these 3 case studies, because a lot of people are very worried, but I'd like to highlight where companies have been able to work with this new system. Previously, the government was someone who was the red tape, and you could avoid if you're a company, especially if you were export driven. However, that's no longer the case. That's actually a big reason why I started the Mexico Political Economist. The political economy is now way more important than it used to be. Take Walmart. We've heard about this massive investment, and it's very much driven on the basis of projects in the Mexican Southeast, traditionally not very high income, but filled with people who now have a bit more money, have access to better jobs because of lots of mega projects in the South, the refinery, the Maya train. And so the pattern of expansion for Walmart follows that. But there's even more, I'd say, there's more interesting case studies in which the companies in question have been forced to interact with the government and have come out winning. TC Energy, to me, is probably one of the most interesting. It's a Canadian oil and gas sort of pipeline construction company. And they, at the beginning of the sexennial, which is AMLO's tenure, they were in pretty much between a rock and a hard place. They hated the idea of working with the government, but ultimately they were forced to, because the government says you're not going to enter the Mexican energy markets without the government. And so they sort of said, all right, fine. How about the CFE, which is the Mexican electricity company? Why don't you come on board as a partner, and you can help us, and you can help us build on this. And so TC went from struggling with the government and being stuck for 2 years when they built one pipeline in paperwork to bringing CFE on board as a partner and turning into Mexico's biggest Canadian investor, billions of dollars invested through TC Energy. Similarly, Huawei, Chinese company, coming in and partnering with Mexican local companies who previously you come in because they know the market, they know the politics, but in this case, regulatory issues are massive. And so they've allied with Telmex in order to work together, because the government is much more likely to talk to national players than international players. And so Huawei is very closely aligned to Telmex, Carlos Slim's outfit, in order to build their presence within the Mexican market. However, obviously, you've heard of this, the massive issues that come along with this new political economy under AMLO. The fiscal squeeze, there's a lot of money being given out, either in sort of pork barrel projects in the Southeast or in just straight up cash handouts. So Claudia Sheinbaum has inherited a bit of a fiscal squeeze. You hear a lot about Republican austerity. It was a famous phrase at the beginning of the AMLO sexennial. That's pretty much over. There's now a new form of austerity, which is a market-imposed one. The markets are a bit jittery about Mexico's sovereign debt, to the extent that the markets have said Pemex, the Mexican oil company, the most indebted in the world, is actually probably best served by sovereign debt rather than on the public markets. The collapse of the opposition makes this ideology easy to distribute across Mexico, because there's nothing to really stop it. And then finally, there's Plan C. What is Plan C? Let's jump to this next slide, and I'll explain briefly. So, rewind a bit. Over the course of the sexennial, AMLO didn't have a massive majority. Today, he has, with his allies, a supermajority, constitution-changing majority. But over the course of his term, he tried to pass a few reforms to get rid of this neoliberal system, regulatory agencies, the judiciary, which he saw as in cahoots with private sector, and many other things. And the judiciary mostly, and sometimes the opposition, were able to stop him because across the sexennial. However, with the supermajority, he's come through and basically swept the Mexican state as we know it to create a brand new one in this image of obradorismo. The most controversial was the judicial reform, which we saw passed on September 11th. And that was basically essential because without the judges interfering, all the rest of the reforms can go through a lot more easily. And so here you've got this sort of this timeline of reforms. Green, they've already passed secondary reforms. Yellow, they're going through the motions, they're in Congress or they're scheduled. But then there's the ones in red where we don't know when they're going to happen, or they've actually been thrown out as AMLO proposed them. It's now in Claudia Sheinbaum's hands, and what we'll be seeing is what Claudia Sheinbaum's plans are, what she's inherited, and what she's planning. But that can come a bit later. Over to you, John.
Thank you, Alex. Alex, I have a quick question. The energy reforms, do we know what changes? Are we talking about basically changing some of the wording of the energy reforms of the Peña Nieto administration?
Yes, it's a direct result. It's a direct reaction to these reforms. The energy reforms 10 years ago have now basically been revoked, and we are seeing Pemex, oil company, and CFE, the electricity company, become predominant actors in the energy markets, with their main purpose being not profit anymore. They were previously state-owned but independent. Now they've been incorporated back into the state, and they are now to be government run, so to speak.
Well, I couldn't imagine a even worse financial performance of a company like Pemex, which I believe has so much debt that if it were sold tomorrow, it would actually have to be sold for nothing, because the owner, the new buyer, would have to assume all the debt, which is worth more than the company's assets. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. I want to briefly show, I really like how Alex pointed out, how is it possible that Mexico, that has clearly grown so little under AMLO, has resulted in a doubling down of popularity for him and the party, which is translated also into a victory by Sheinbaum. Well, let's look at that growth. And certainly the sexenio under AMLO averaged only 0.9% per year growth. Now, of course, we had COVID, and that is to be taken into account, but we've also had pretty strong negative growth events. Of course, in end of 94 and all of 95, 2001 slowdown, which was really started in the United States. Similarly, in 2008, 2009. So some of these were exogenous, some of them were, came out of Mexico themselves. The point being that, why is it that we had such limited growth? And why is it that, what is it that drove AMLO's sexenio versus others? Well, if you go back to Salinas, his growth was driven by privatizations and sort of the lifting of the animal spirits in Mexico that had been dormant for so long. Under Zedillo, it was really about trade arbitrage. It was the NAFTA getting into full force and Mexico taking advantage of its cheaper wages. Under Fox, it was really foreign investment and also the further liberalization of the economy, which also continued under Calderon. But of course, Calderon really took on the cartels with a full frontal attack, creating massive levels of violence and in many ways hurting his own sexenio, and which is what helped the PRI come back to power under Peña Nieto. Peña Nieto's big sort of legislative push was the energy reforms, which began as very much a nepotistic exercise focused on bringing in the big players from within Mexico to take advantage of Mexico's deregulated energy sector. In fact, because the price of oil collapsed at this time, it ended up that foreign companies were the ones that were interested and had the know-how and the manpower and the capital to invest in Mexico's energy. And we saw them invest heavily in different areas, both in conventional and unconventional. And AMLO, of course, as Alex pointed out, his growth is really being driven by consumption, because the government spending, other than the last year of 24, which was really went on steroids to help Morena seal its victory, was fairly muted. And it was really the consumer that drove that. And I'll get into that in a sec. Let's move to the next slide. In fact, the markets demanded higher levels of return under AMLO, which is really a translation of the perceived higher political risk. Now, foreigners maintained, and the foreign press maintained, a fairly neutral stance on AMLO, but the Mexican investor class and the Mexican press was far more critical of him from day one and far more skeptical of him. The central bank responded in kind and lifted interest rates, and this became very apparent, particularly when inflation, post-COVID inflation began to spread across the world, the Mexican central bank responded a full year ahead of the U.S. Central Bank in lifting its interest rates, and so created this carry trade business that brought in billions of dollars of short-term capital in Mexico and lifted the peso, such that in 23, the Mexican peso and Brazilian real were two of the strongest performing currencies in the world. Now, that's important because if you're a consumer in any Latin American country, you feel wealthier when your currency is strong, because so much of what you consume, even if the product's made in Mexico, is going to have a strong dollarized component to it, not to mention fully imported goods. And so when the peso is strong, consumers feel well remunerated, they feel wealthier, and that's important. And that's a lesson that AMLO had learned from his pre-days. You strengthen the currency towards the end of your sexennial so that people elect back the party. And we see this on the next slide. If we could go to the next slide. There we go. Here is median household income in US dollars, how they grew under AMLO versus other sexennials. Outgrew them all. Even though it was the slowest growing GDP, the median house. Now, why is that? Well, again, it's the relative strength of the currency. But it's also, as Alex pointed out, redistribution. So it's handouts and it's stronger minimum wages, which really helped shrink that extreme polarity of income distribution in Mexico between the wealthy and the poor. And so for all of these reasons, the median household went up. And that was fundamental to keeping the Morena in power. So I think with that, let's go to the next slide. Oh, one more. One thing I wanted to point out is, although the growth of exports out of Mexico did slow vis-a-vis previous sexennials, it still grew at 32%. That's a little over 5% per year, which is double the global average. Now, considering that Mexico-US is the largest trade corridor in the world, the fact that it's still growing at double the global growth levels tells you something. There's still room for growth. There was still, this engine of nearshoring that brought a lot of assemblers to Mexico that otherwise would have stayed in China. And this was all part and parcel of what's driving the growth. So in spite of his politics, in spite of him being very punishing of or critical of the wealthy class in Mexico, foreigners continue to invest in Mexico and believe in Mexico, U.S. trade. Now I believe it's back to you, Alex.
Thank you, John.
Next slide, please.
So here we are, the present day. Claudia Sheinbaum, the Presidenta of Mexico, and one is a very different beast from AMLO. There's a lot of worry about whether or not she's actually in control, but I'd like to take us back so that we can understand whether or not she has a chance of governing on her own, or whether she's still completely tethered to López Obrador. The biggest question when we talk about Claudia Sheinbaum is, will she follow down the footsteps of populism that her predecessor took, or is she more of a seasoned technocrat? There are good reasons to think for both, right? She rose alongside López Obrador when he was mayor of Mexico City. She became mayor in the previous sexennial, but she took a different approach. She had a far more technocratic cabinet, and she was far more evidence-based in her way of governing. You could see this in the two big challenges that she met when she arrived in Mexico. One was the pandemic, which she didn't quite succeed at. I think there she was under the thumb of López Obrador, who said, laissez-faire, ironically, let everyone just continue with their lives. Prohibido prohibir was the phrase, which cost many, many lives in Mexico, far larger than the per capita average around the world with similar countries. However, in terms of security, which is what Claudia Sheinbaum really campaigned on, you can see with this graph how well she did, at least on official figures, but also people do feel safer. So you see in the sexennial before her term, crime was rising, and there was a big worry that Mexico was going to turn into another failed state within Mexico. And she turned it around. This was with the help of Omar Garcia Harfuch, who we'll be talking about. However, there was a big change in how she dealt with crime. as opposed to what the government at the national level did, which was a focus on intelligence, a focus on police work. Very different from the militarized approach, but that's because Mexico City has about 80,000 police officers in quite a small space of space. The National Guard, which is the equivalent of the federal police across the whole country, has more or less about double that, which is nothing for a massive country like Mexico. So which one's going to win out, populist or technocrat? Well, we've actually got clues for this, which I think is really important, which is the 2021 midterms and how she snatched victory from the jaws of defeat. 2021 was a very different moment from now. Now it feels like Morena is unstoppable and basically nothing's going to change in the near future. But that wasn't the case very recently. In Mexico City specifically, when Claudia Sheinbaum was mayor, there was a massive shellacking of the Morena party. Mexico City was split right down the middle. The East went completely for the opposition, whereas the West went for the opposition, whereas the East stayed with Morena, but was slightly tenuous. And then that's where you saw this interesting dynamic happen. Because Sheinbaum was weakened by that election, the populist, we'll call it the ultras, came in and forced her to get rid of a lot of her technocrats. The biggest sort of example of this was her right-hand man came in, who then became her substitute mayor, Martí Bartres. He is one of these ultras who came in and shifted her path from the technocratic way to the populist way. However, ironically, even though she lost control to an extent, she gained the trust of AMLO, which put her ahead in his estimation for the presidency, which, as we can see, really worked out for her. But this, of course, now opens the question again. Is she going to be able to govern free from interference from AMLO? Well, let's see the next slide. The cabinet is what's going to give us the clues for this, because what we're going to see, again, is a similar macrocosm of what we saw in Mexico City, because we've got a division of the old radicals, the ultras, the people, her technocratic team who she's inherited from Mexico City, and then an interesting cohort of seasoned pragmatists who could go either way, but are very experienced in government. So the seasoned pragmatists are there in large part to make people understand that there is continuity, but also there is expertise. They're sort of the perfect combination. Marcelo Ebrard, the economy minister, and Rogelio Ramírez de la O, the finance minister, are very much brilliant examples of this, because they're old hands within the AMLO government, but they've shown to be independent of his populism. Ramírez de la O is known for being relatively straight-edged financially, which the markets appreciate. He was the first cabinet member to be named by Sheinbaum right after she was elected, and they got on a call with investors the day after her election to soothe fears of Morena's supermajority. And then you've got a list of other men and women who are well-known names, old hands that people can trust in. The old radicals are still there, though. You need those people to keep both the pure ultra obradoristas on side, and they're the ones who move the electorate. Paco Ignacio Taibo is an interesting one to me because he feels relatively irrelevant in terms of his title. He's the director of the National Publishing House. However, it's not, as they say in Spanish, it's not el cargo, es el encargo. It's not the job. It's not the title, it's the job you've been given. But Ignacio Taibo is a massive mover and shaker within Morena, and he can mobilize masses within Mexico City. He was a key person in getting rid of the technocrats when Claudia Sheinbaum lost or did badly in the midterms, and he's the one who brought her back up with that mobilization. Then you've got the CDMX Dream Team, Mexico City, Omar Garcia Harfuch, we talked about security, Luz Helena Gonzalez, her previous finance minister, who is now taking on the behemoth and the quagmire of energy in Mexico. If she succeeds, we might see the final political glass ceiling being shattered, with her perhaps becoming the next finance secretary. That's what the whispers are, but only if she succeeds. And that's what's really interesting to me. Ultimately, the success of the team that she's sort of vouched for from Mexico City versus the success of the ultras on the ground, building up the party and also mobilizing resources within the government, we'll see the balance of power shift on the basis of that. And then the dark horses, the top brass, the military men. These people are really interesting because we know very little about them. However, we've got a few hints and clues about who they are from their profiles. Far more technocratic than previous military posts, and that gives people the idea that maybe they'll be slightly more aligned with Claudia Sheinbaum, but we simply just can't know. Next slide, please. And then finally, the political priorities and the policy priorities of Claudia Sheinbaum. So social welfare, her very first proprietary policy was handouts for women between 60 and 64 years old, so before the threshold of the old people's pension that was given out by AMLO. That, of course, puts a lot of pressure on the fiscal side of things. So she's rolling it out very gradually. And here we see a bit of her style coming through. She isn't going to impose a policy. She's going to test it. She might go back if it doesn't work out, if the markets react negatively. And the markets seem to appreciate that. However, you can see that the government is in trouble fiscally simply because of the fact that they've stopped hiring. They're pulling back other non-essential or non-politically sensitive things. The government is very keen to perhaps, at least not at this point, put up taxes, but they're definitely rolling back a bit of spending, similar to what we saw with AMLO at the beginning of his term. We've got no elections coming up anytime soon, so this is the time to do it. New crime-fighting strategies, essential, and we'll be talking about that later, but Omar Garcia Harfuch is coming in to basically replicate what he tried to do and succeeded at doing in Mexico City. It's a completely different kettle of fish, though. The army is in charge of security in Mexico. He gets to write the plan, but the people who get to execute it are the military men and women. So the army, the navy, and the National Guard, which was created as a civilian force, but has transitioned into the armed forces with an AMLO reform as of a few days ago. Then, again, we see her measured approach to regulatory reform. Lots of people are really worried because it could even contravene USMCA on the eve of the review in 2026. So we see a bit of a slowing down here. INAI, which is the transparency agency, is starting to negotiate with the government. Before they were intransigent. Now there's at least dialogue. They might still go through as packaged, but the conversation soothes a lot of what people are worried about. Renewable energy, we can talk more about this. I think what's really interesting is how the nationalist vision of energy in Mexico is actually rubs against the renewable policies that she's touting. So we've got some issues here in terms of how they're going to be able to square that circle. We can talk about that a bit more later on, but I'm going to hand over to John, who is probably going to dive deeper into this US-Mexico relationship, which is essential to the survival of Mexico's finances and its current economic development plan.
Thank you, Alex. Indeed, the next slide, I believe we're going to address that very issue. So, what to make of U.S. bilateral relations? Well, first of all, although Mexico can surprisingly lead or strongly influence these relationships with their very adept diplomatic corps, the fact remains that the disruption that's going to happen with this relationship is going to come out of Washington, regardless of who wins between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. Now, I'd be lying if I knew, and if anybody here knows who's going to win the U.S. election. I think the polls at the moment favor Donald Trump because of the electoral college system and the fact that he's winning those battleground states, and the fact that polls tend to favor Democrats because the way polling is done is usually urban focused and less rural. But the ground game, which is, will more people come out to vote for a given party than would otherwise not be willing to vote, would rather stay home and not vote? The Democrats have a better ground game than the Republicans do. So the polls don't tell the full story, and therefore it really, really is tough to predict who's going to win. And who wins will definitely have an impact on relationships with Mexico, although it is not as binary as you would think. First of all, you have to understand that this sort of anti-Chinese sentiment in Washington has been building for a long time. And specifically as it relates to Mexico, it's also been building for several years, and it's the auto parts industry that's been leading this lobbying effect. Not just American auto parts makers, but also Canadian auto parts makers. The Canadian share of the auto parts business in the USMCA trading space has dropped considerably over the last few years. And it's done so because of inflation in Canada, because of lack of labor, very tight labor situation. And the Mexicans have continued to grow in part because of Chinese auto parts makers moving to Mexico and the lower price points that they can offer. So there is anger amongst the trade unions and amongst the companies in this space in both Canada and the US. So we will see, regardless of who wins the US election, a concerted effort to target Chinese companies in Mexico and somehow punish them without throwing the USMCA out the window. Now, one of the things that's definitely under suspicion is the fact that so many Chinese companies were able to come over to Mexico and in short time set up operations and somehow comply with the local content rules of the USMCA. And so many believe that there's in fact been massive corruption whereby these Chinese companies have essentially paid customs officials to receive certificate of origin documentation that shows that they comply with local content, which I believe in completed autos is close to 60%. So for that to happen as quickly as it has definitely raises some suspicions. A Trump presidency will push for more protectionism, and there's right now a big debate as to what are the legal levers that he has at his disposal. Now, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a trade lawyer, but my understanding is that the sort of consensus thinking right now is that he can, via executive order, issue new tariffs so long as the countries that are impacted are not operating under the guise of a free trade agreement that received legislative approval by the US Congress. And that, of course, includes the USMCA. So in other words, any change in imports on Mexican goods or Canadian goods would have to pass through the US Congress and couldn't be affected by decree. Whereas in many other countries with whom the US does not enjoy a free trade agreement, that could be issued by decree. So that if that holds true, and again, I don't go to the bank with that point of view, but if it holds true, then the real risk point for Mexico will be when the USMCA is under official renewal and review in 2026, 2 short years from now. And that will oblige Congress to revote on the accord, and therefore will be the moment to change it if, in fact, a Trump administration or a Harris administration want to change things. A Harris administration is going to want to push through immigration reform. This is a real bugaboo of hers that she was not able to push it through, in part because of political interference by the MAGA wing of the Republican Party. That immigration reform is long overdue in the United States. The US has a ridiculously outdated view on immigration, very much tied to the sort of sentimentality of Ellis Island immigration dating back to the 19th century. And there's some real need to change that. The US needs labor, but it also needs stricter movement across borders. And so we will see under a immigration bill, stronger border enforcement. Another really interesting area is, of course, the energy reforms under the Peña Nieto administration opened up investment from the private sector in renewable energy, including energy distribution, so small scale solar panels on the roof of your factory that then could be, with the excess generation, could be sold back into the grid. This led to all kinds of projects that started up at the end of the Peña Nieto administration, the beginning of the Trump administration. And they were all pushed back by decrees that many argue went against the rules of both the energy reforms that were built into the Mexican Constitution, as well as the USMCA. And there has been a lawsuit, a massive lawsuit by the energy sector, combining both conventional and renewable actors in places like Texas and Oklahoma against Mexico, that was held back by the Biden administration. But if Trump wins, may go forward. Now, it may end up being a bargaining chip, but it's a massive lawsuit totaling probably over $40 billion against the Mexican government, and that may go forward. So we are definitely in for some rocky period of time, and the Mexicans know it, and they are doing all they can right now. Sheinbaum had a major presentation in front of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in Mexico City just a few days ago, essentially, first of all, announcing $20 billion of new investments by American companies, but also really trying to soften the rhetoric that inevitably is hard during the campaign towards trying to reassure American investors that their assets will be protected inside Mexico. We'll see. Moved on to the next one, please. What can we expect in terms of growth over the next couple of years? Well, we are definitely in a sort of soft period of growth, both in the United States and in Mexico. Now, why is this? Well, first of all, there was a bit of a bump in 2024 as AMLO turned on the spigots of fiscal spending, particularly in the form of construction projects, put a lot of people to work, make them feel good about themselves, and go out and vote for Morena, boosted growth somewhat. Well, that money's gone. And that construction, although Sheinbaum has some very, very ambitious infrastructure build-out plans, she needs to go out to capital markets and borrow money because the government doesn't have that money as it is. So they would have to go out, issue bonds, and capture that money, which Mexico probably can do because their public debt are pretty low. But that takes time. In the meantime, you have a still skeptical. Now, while the foreign investors continue to invest throughout the AMLO sexennial, particularly more and more in manufacturing, nearshore driven, the Mexican investor class was skeptical from day one. From the time he canceled the first airport, the Mexican investor class really took note. Now, some of them, as Alex pointed out, were very adept. And of course, Carlos Slim has been very adept through all political changes to remain on top. But a lot ended up just reinvesting what they needed to keep their businesses going, and meanwhile pushed somewhere about $150 billion of money out of Mexico over the last 6 years. Now, that means that Mexico has not invested much in modernization and productivity gaining. So if your companies are not absorbing new investment and new technology, the productivity levels remain low. And you see the labor productivity growth of Mexico vis-a-vis its competitors, most important competitors in Latin America, and it's low. Now, also, we are seeing that the central bank is bringing down interest rates. There was a premium above the U.S. interest rates, and now there is not, and soon that premium will be smaller. And so, excuse me, that's going to soften the peso. The peso already took a hit with the Plan C, the September surprise, when AMLO changed the constitution, and it's going to continue to be relatively soft, such that if you look at that middle chart, the total size of Mexico's economy in dollars, even though it continues to grow, its total size in dollars will actually shrink over the next 2 years. And that's important because for many of you who are exporting goods to Mexico or who have Mexican operations that are earning in pesos, you have to repatriate those profits in dollars. And so that's going to hurt somewhat. So with that, let's move to the next. Very briefly, I want to point out that how you look at risk really depends on the type of business you run. So if you run a business that is inside Mexico and is earning pesos, you have one view of the world. Your assets are certainly exposed to legal risk and regulatory risk. If you're an export manufacturer, you probably don't care so much about currency, things like currency risk or even an economic slowdown, because ultimately, as long as your foreign destination market is doing well, you're fine. And then for those who are selling goods into Mexico, you're probably less exposed to a lot of regulations because you don't have assets in Mexico. So I want to point out that there's three very different views on risk. And this is important because often we take our views of risk from newspapers that are really focused on financial investors and much less so on people either exporting or importing. On the left, we've kind of listed in order of what we believe from the most probable to less probable these different risk categories. So corruption is not going away. It's been there in every sexenio that I've certainly studied in Mexico over the last 36 years, and it's not going to go away. And it's there in part because of regulatory red tape and uncertainty, and the delays that causes, and therefore the need to speed things up, which usually results in bribing. We are in a period of transition, so there will be uncertainty. As Alex pointed out, Sheinbaum is trying to thread this needle between maintaining the legacy of AMLO and keeping all of his allies in Congress happy, while at the same time charting her own path, which is more technocratic, more modern, more transformative, using a completely different cabinet. And that's a tough needle to thread rather. Previous presidents have usually just sort of abandoned the past and started afresh. She can't afford to do that politically. So there will be regulatory uncertainty. There will be political interference. There will be an economic slowdown. There will probably be, or 50-50 likelihood of some sort of legal dispute by the American energy sector against the Mexican government. We may see higher taxes in Mexico. And certainly if Trump wins, there will be, or there could be, a extended review process of the USMCA 2 years from now that ends up sort of causing jitters here and there. We don't believe that the judicial reforms are going to impact legal risk very quickly. It will take time. And likewise, the currency risk, we don't see a huge likelihood of currency risk. Of course, if the S&Ps of the world decide that Mexico's government is doing things badly, they may downgrade Mexican sovereign debt. They've said for the moment that's not going to happen. But if it were downgraded, it would be now below investment grade. They're in the bottom rung of investment grade. So then that's trouble, because all those hedge funds and large institutional investors that hold Mexican pesos, that hold Mexican bonds, and even large equities in Mexico would have to abandon them because of their own governance rules, or at least lower their exposure to them. And that would have a material impact on the peso. But for now, that doesn't appear to be likely to happen. So with that, we want to invite you guys. I think several of you have posted some questions already, and I'll go ahead and sort of moderate these. I think, Alex, the first one is best handled by yourself, and that is, how likely is President Sheinbaum to really depart from AMLO's policies? What's your feeling on that?
So we can't tell, obviously, but there's so many clues that we can interpret, right? I think the key one is the cabinet, right? As we've discussed, the cabinet will be defining which direction policy takes. The president ultimately is the head of the executive, but the executors below her. Ebrard is there because he knows USMCA. That's why he's there, even though he's a political rival. Rodriguez de la O is in the finance ministry because he's a continuity but a conservative option. If any of these things change, keep an eye on that. That'll give you an idea of which way they're going. But also, I think it's really important to take into account that AMLO, he, like Cincinnatus to his plow, he's gone away, but he could come back. And he said he'll come back if he's ever upset by certain policy. There are certain key policies that AMLO's very keen on maintaining. Energy, social programs, a few others. And those issues particularly are the ones where she's got to really stick to the line. But she's got a lot more leeway than it seems on other things, like green energy, right? Like, sure, you can go towards the green energy side, but you've got to keep along the AMLO line on energy generally. And so that's the sort of like overview that you can get from what'll happen over the next few weeks, months, and years.
Terrific. So I see that you answered a question that was posted around the alliance between Huawei out of China, the telecom equipment provider, and América Móvil, which is a Mexican-based mobile operator, but operates across the region. So if anyone's interested in understanding the answer to that, Alex has put together a nice written response in the Q&A area. We still have an open question, and that is, what risk do you see with relation to judicial reform? How will Scheinbaum manage its implementation? Great question. Do you want to take that on, Alex?
Yes. So again, lots of question marks. This is actually really in the legislative branch's hands, and that is very much an AMLO. We'll call it ideology controlled, because AMLO, I think, is far more sophisticated than people think. He's not going to be tinkering directly or coming out and spewing stuff on social media like other presidents in the region. He's already got his pieces in place and his ducks in a row. These people know what AMLO wants and they're happy to enact it. And so an interesting point of contention was a few days ago, there was one of the secondary reforms in the judicial reform mentioned something that Claudia Sheinbaum didn't actually like. And so she mentioned it in her daily press conference, and the Congress stepped off. But you can see who's in the driving seat for this particular thing. The judicial reform and its secondary reforms are very much in the hands of an AMLO Congress, so to speak. Claudia Sheinbaum can push back on certain things, but it needs to get passed in a way that is satisfactory to the Obradorista vision of things.
Excellent, excellent. Well, with that, we've answered the questions that you've posed for this section, and certainly at the end of the third hour, we can retake some of these. If there's more questions in the political and economic sphere, we can certainly address those. Okay, we're back. I'm remiss to say that I forgot one important slide. I had mentioned at the very beginning of the webinar that I was very taken aback by Alex's newsletter, his organization's newsletter, when I first came across it about 6 months ago, the Mexico Political Economist. There is here a QR code that you can point your phone at, or if you're on your computer, you can type in that URL address, and both will take you to where you can sign up for the newsletter. Again, there's I believe he works under a freemium model where he publishes a couple of articles a month for free, and then if you want access to additional analysis, that comes at a subscription. But well worth signing up for. Really good insight. You know, not to be overly critical of foreign press, but I find that the foreign press really missed the boat by and large with the AMLO administration. Very much just looked at him, the man, and not at the party and not at the dynamics, and didn't get enough into the weeds to really understand what's going on in Mexico. So let's move on to chapter 2. Mexico operational risk. For many of you, whether you are sourcing from Mexico or whether you are exporting product into Mexico, or even if you have operations that involve the movement of product and people around Mexico, you are both familiar with and exposed to operational risk. And so it is my pleasure to turn things over to Diego Rodriguez, the head of our logistics and industrial practice at AMI, who will lead this chapter and be supported by Chris Dalby with his comments related to security. So over to you, Diego.
Thank you, John. And hi, everyone. I'm really pleased. I'm very grateful to have you for the next 45, 50 minutes. I know that your agendas are really busy, and having you here, it's a real pleasure for me, and I would love to bring as much value as possible for you. So let's begin. And before I kick off with these economic corridors and setting the stage about Mexico, I like to talk about myself a little bit, so you know where my comments and all the background behind what I'm sharing today. So I'm originally from Colombia, but based in Miami since 2013. And there is a famous saying that reads, "There's no prophet in its own land." And Mexico basically became my second motherland. And I have done probably over 75 projects in Mexico in the past decade. and I have been doing market intelligence for the past 14 years across Latin America. So I want to share with you one or two things that I have learned along this decade in Mexico, and I'm very excited to share this panel with my colleague Chris Dalby, who's a rock star when it comes to the security and the world of crime. So I'm really excited to share with you all that we have learned across the multiple studies that we conduct. So moving on to the next slide, I think Alex talked about this very briefly, but I want to set the stage because the reality is that despite Mexico is the 9th global player attracting inbound FDI and the 3rd among emerging markets, the reality is that Mexico is fumbling the ball when it comes to FDI and when it comes to the nearshoring opportunity. And you might be surprised by that headline, but the reality is that, as Alex pointed out, 97% of the FDI that was attracted to Mexico in 2023 was reinvestments, and only 3% are new investments. So when everyone talks about the nearshoring opportunity, how Mexico became the top trading partner for the US, well, I would be concerned to see those numbers stagnant. And the reality is that when you look at FDI, for that main reason, Mexico City is the top destination because Mexico City is one of the largest urban, metropolitan urban centers in the world. And also, Mexico City is the largest consumer market. So you have companies like Amazon, Mercado Libre reinvesting in this large consumer market. So you have lots of real estate available, and lots of commercial and residential investments in Mexico City. So that's the main reason. But when we start looking at the different economic corridors for those who are not based in Mexico, perhaps those that are based in Europe or in the US, you will get to understand how FDI goes around the country in the following economic sectors. So when we think about manufacturing, well, manufacturing, we have a big manufacturing region in the northeast of Mexico. So we have Nuevo León, Monterrey leading the charge. And when it comes to manufacturing, it's a key area to attracting automotive manufacturing, for instance. Then when you look at the West Coast, you have Baja California and Baja California Sur, again, near the border with the US, and they're driving the investments in healthcare, medical devices, maquila as well. And then when you come to the center of the country, you have the Bajío region. You have, again, manufacturing, automotive with Querétaro. You have Guanajuato as well, San Luis de Potosí, the aerospace industry as well in Querétaro. So that is a key economic corridor that is linked with the US through the railway system. In Guanajuato, you have one of the largest intermodal facilities in the country. So then you come south and you have massive tourism investments. Just Tuesday, Royal Caribbean announced 1.5 billion investment in Quintana Roo. So the south of Mexico, as Alex pointed out, is the most underdeveloped region in the country. And the reason for AMLO to push with these very aggressive projects is, as Alex mentioned, basically it's to develop this region to actually create new jobs. And that's also part of the interoceanic project that I will discuss later on. So if we move on to the next slide, I like to show you the specific chart that basically back up my comment about Mexico fumbling the ball when it comes to nearshoring. Because if you look at the last decade, the ballpark range in FDI has been between 30 and $35 billion. And when we think about nearshoring, well, we are seeing Mexico becoming the top trading partner, but how is that investment actually being implemented in Mexico? And that's something that we need to clarify the story to bring clarity to you guys. And the reality is that, for instance, China has doubled its exports to Mexico in the last 4 years, and it has quadrupled its exports to Mexico in the last decade. So that's very interesting. So now we might get Chinese exports to Mexico in the ballpark range of $85 to $95 billion at the end of 2024. So that gives you an idea how trade, as John mentioned, how trade is actually being circumvented through Mexico to reach the US. And that's a reality. That's a reality happening right now. So when you look at the map, it's very interesting to see how FDI is moving across the northern border in Mexico, because it is really convenient for companies to be located there, to move their products really fast. There's also a massive real estate built over the past decades. Now we will discuss how's the inventory availability, because that's another concern, that's another challenge. However, again, you look at the biggest pockets of investments and the biggest pockets in which international companies are investing in Mexico are the same usual aspects: Querétaro, Monterrey, Mexico City, Sonora, Chihuahua. So that gives us an idea of where investments are taking place and how logistics infrastructure plays into this equation. So moving on to the next slide, I like to show what's the infrastructure and how Mexico is actually underinvesting, because what John and Alex mentioned, it's a key element. And let me be very emphatic. Mexico has underinvested in its infrastructure over the past decade, because AMLO, for instance, was very disciplined with its fiscal spending over the first 4 years of its government, and then spending started to increase, but in its pet projects, in the interoceanic corridor, or in the Dos Bocas refinery, or in the Maya train. But the rest of the infrastructure in Mexico, actually to serve the potential opportunities of nearshoring, is lagging behind. So when you look at on the map on the right side, the railway infrastructure, well, Mexico is very well connected with the US on the west line, on the center line, and in the east line. So understanding that the port of Manzanillo and the port of Lázaro Cárdenas are well connected through the intermodal shipping solutions, it is really key for companies that are actually considering the country to manufacture and to move products to the north of Mexico, because we will look at how trucking it's becoming a nightmare for companies, especially dealing with cargo theft. And Chris can talk about that in greater length than myself. But it's really important to understand that you need to select the facilities or the locations in Mexico if you're producing or manufacturing based on the connections to the railway system, to minimize your security concerns when it comes to trucking, and also to minimize the spending on transportation. And when you look at the potential projects that Mexico is developing, well, the Interoceanic Corridor comes to mind. That is a very interesting project. And last week I was in San Martin in the Caribbean Shipping Association annual event discussing about this project. Will it be an alternative for the Panama Canal, or what's the goal of this project? The reality is that if Mexico wants to attract companies to the south of the country, it needs to develop infrastructure to accommodate industrial parks, to accommodate transportation, but most importantly, to eliminate the security risks for companies moving cargo from the south to the north by trucks. So in that sense, having access to both ports on the Gulf Coast and on the Pacific, it's very important for companies so they can actually reach both of the US coast through maritime shipping. And that's going to open up opportunities for logistics players and to offer intermodal solutions, but most importantly, becoming centers of development for the south of Mexico, which has ample resources. And we will see that in the next slide. So the next slide, please. It's this picture around how Mexico became the top trading partner with the US and how cargo volumes have been increasing. So when you look at the charts, it is really interesting to see how intermodal railway transportation has doubled in the last decade. And there are key three factors for that. First of all, you have lower prices by moving your freight through the rail services. Second, you reduce your carbon footprint. And when we think about these global players manufacturing in Mexico, many of them have specific mandates to reduce their carbon footprint and to achieve their net zero emissions by 2040 or 2050. So that's part of the reason as well. And third reason for the expansion of the intermodal service in Mexico is security concerns. So the intermodal system and the intermodal solutions have been gaining momentum, and the players that offer these services, I don't want to name any names here because of sensitivities, as well as part of the projects that we have led. There are some specific companies that have been gaining tremendous market share because they have well positioned in this intermodal market. So when we think about security risks and security concerns, the railway system has been one of the greatest solutions that companies have been employing, especially since cargo theft has been increasing really rapidly in the last 3 years. So I think during 2024, the growth of cargo theft has been 25-30% compared to the figures from last year. So that gives you an idea in terms of how security risks are impacting the supply chain in Mexico. Now, moving on to the next slide, I like to talk about how Mexico ports actually combine with the intermodal, because that's part of the strategy that the Mexican government has been pushing, and also the private sector, how we can decongest the roads and use ports to facilitate, for instance, short sea shipping, or to facilitate the movement of goods out of Mexico as a medium to long-term strategy. However, ports in Mexico are actually underperforming versus its regional peers. So when you look at, for instance, this logistics port index, you will see that Cartagena, for instance, is ranked number 3 at the global level. In Callao in Peru, it's number 26. But when you look at Lázaro Cárdenas and Manzanillo, the two largest ports on the Pacific, they are ranked 50 and 331. So there are many challenges when it comes to operating in these ports. You have congestion, you have low port draft, for instance, in Veracruz as well, on the Gulf Coast. And that's one of the reasons why companies did not think about Mexico as a potential alternative when we were dealing with the potential strike of the US East Coast and Gulf Coast ports. That's the main reason, because on the Gulf, you have underdeveloped infrastructure, you have low port draft, and which is unable to handle the massive volumes coming from Europe. So that was one of the key impediments for Mexico to actually take advantage of this opportunity. Now, when it comes to the potential benefits of these facilities, well, Veracruz is actually very, it's a location strategically positioned on the Caribbean and the Gulf. And when you think about potential connections between the Caribbean for short sea shipping and to become a connection between the Mexican producers and potential tier 1, tier 2 producers in Central America and the Caribbean, the port of Veracruz could become a potential alternative. However, infrastructure investments are required. Now, when we think about Lázaro Cárdenas and Manzanillo, Manzanillo is developing a very interesting strategy to create industrial parks and to expand its facilities to accommodate companies to produce next to the port. So companies can avoid security risks and can actually ship their goods faster. So that's very interesting. And they're actually investing right now on developing that project. However, a key consideration for everyone operating in Mexico is actually how efficient and productive workers are. So we will discuss that in a bit. But perhaps, Chris, you can talk a bit here about some examples. I know you will discuss this in your specific section about security, but perhaps you can share some examples about the situation in Manzanillo and Lázaro Cárdenas very briefly.
Of course, this will be a little bit of a preview about what we're going to go into in chapter 3. But
Yeah.
this is a perfect intersection, well chosen, Diego, to talk about how operational risk begins to intersect with security and criminal risk. Ports and the cities of Tijuana and Nuevo Laredo, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, are examples of where already, for 10, even 20 years sometimes, you begin to see Mexico's booming economy, the peak of foreign investment, hubs that are absolutely vital for commerce and trade, operating legitimately side by side in those same areas with hubs of cartel violence, of a fight for control for those same resources, whether that's for money laundering, whether that's to blend illegitimate cargo with licit cargo, whether it's to have access to container shipping, to bulk shipping. And what we see in Lázaro Cárdenas and Manzanillo is that for at least 25 years, and increasingly, those ports, not only those ports themselves, but the roads leading, the highways leading to those ports, the cities along those highways, going all the way to the US border, are hubs for cartel violence and a fight for control. And it's very, very rare to see violence wane in those areas because there's always a new group willing to challenge at some point along that supply chain. So when we talk about Lázaro Cárdenas, Manzanillo, Veracruz, to a lesser extent, we're going to begin to think about how organized crime in Mexico is affecting the interests of foreign companies more than ever before. And even if it's not affecting you, even if it's not affecting the core business, it's affecting your supply chain. It's going to be affecting your logistics partners. It's going to be affecting your trucking partners. And so there is now an awareness raising that we have to talk about during this masterclass about how much protection, how much risk awareness foreign investors in Mexico need to have, not just at the ports, not just at the border cities, but across their supply chain in a way that hasn't necessarily been part of the conversation before. Back to you, Diego.
Thank you, Chris. Really enlightful and comments. Thank you so much. So, Vale, let's move on to the next slide. I think we will discuss the key operational risks that companies need to be aware. I'm sure that many of you are familiar with this, but let's take a deep dive in terms of what we see. So, moving on to the next one. So, the first challenge that companies faced when they're operating in Mexico, when they're manufacturing or producing, are electricity and water shortages. And a recent survey conducted by the BBA research team identified that energy is the top challenge that companies face. And just to give you a concrete number of this situation, the Mexican Association of Industrial Parks released a report in which 91%, I will repeat that number, 91% of industrial parks in Mexico face power failures across multiple days of the year. And that's very worrisome if you are a logistics company servicing, for instance, the cold storage market segment, or if you're producing goods that are highly intensive when it comes to the use of electricity. So that's very concerning. And when we link this situation with the fact that Alex mentioned that the new administration of the President Sheinbaum is targeting that 45% of Mexico's power matrix will come from renewables, that is a massive task. Because when you look at the chart below, the pie chart, you will see that 81% of the power generation in Mexico is actually coming from the fossil fuels. And that's because of the energy policy put in place by AMLO during the past 6 years. And what we believe is really difficult to depart from that. So finding reliable power and cheap electricity in Mexico, it's one of the greatest concerns. Now, when you look at how the Mexico map is distributed in terms of the places where foreign investment has been taking place over the past 30 years, the majority of those locations, again, have resources overexploited. So you look at the Bajío region, you look at the northern region, those places have overexploited resources, and that's when your company and your partners need to think about benchmarking different options and alternatives, options that were not considered previously and that need to be considered now because things are rapidly changing in Mexico. So that is very important to be considered. So the south of Mexico is becoming an opportunity for companies. So are you aware of how you can operate in the south of Mexico? What potential partners you could get that are legitimate businesses in the south of Mexico? That's something that your business needs to consider. So moving on to the next slide, I like to talk about the real estate nightmare that Mexico is going through right now. So the country is not keeping up with the nearshoring demand when it comes to those reinvestments. And the reality is that when you look at the regional clusters, it is a challenge to find industrial parks or space available. So just to give an example, Monterrey and Ciudad de Mexico, they have a vacancy rate close to 2%, which is extremely, extremely low. And when you think about how industrial parks are built in Mexico, 60% of them are found in the Golden Triangle between Monterrey, Guadalajara, and Mexico City. 60% of the industrial parks are there. So there's massive underinvestment on other regions in Mexico. And that's something that companies are actually tackling right now, but it takes time to build industrial parks. It takes time to find the right location. So that's one of the greatest situations and greatest challenges impacting companies when looking into Mexico as an opportunity to manufacture closer to the US. Moving on to the next slide, I like to talk about this surprise. Little known to the outside world is the fact that Mexico has a labor shortage. And just to compare, in the US, we have an unemployment rate close to 4.5%. In Mexico, it's around 3%. And when you look at those cities in the northern region of Mexico, you have an unemployment rate close to 2%, in some cases, even 1.5%. So finding workers, it's a challenge for a company when looking into the country to manufacture. So, and the other challenge is finding productive workers, which is the second element of the equation. It's just not to find employees, but how productive they are. And as John pointed out, productivity is a great challenge in the country. So just to give you an example, in the 1960s, between the 1960s and 2019, the World Bank measured how productivity grew between Southeast Asia and Latin America. So on average, Southeast Asia was able to grow its productivity by 2.6% per year. Now, when we look at Latin America, and in this case, Mexico, productivity levels grew only by 0.06%. So when you look at the disparity in terms of productivity, the reality is that the economies in Latin America and the economy in Mexico could be 3 times larger than it is today when measured in GDP because of the productivity factor. So there are only 2 ways to increase your GDP. Basically, you have more people working, or the output per individual is higher, that is measured through workers' productivity. And that's one of the greatest obstacles that Mexico faces today, worker productivity. However, not everything is so bad. There's a bright side on this story. And the reality is that Mexico has been doing a really good job when in terms of training its students, its young population. And today, Mexico is graduating more students per capita than the US in the science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And that's a great achievement. So you have both sides of the story. You have a labor shortage, but you have a country that is training its workers to fill the demand for skilled labor, which is the next economic transition that Mexico is going through. So first you had the maquila, But now you have companies looking into Mexico to actually insert in the North American supply chains, and the opportunity to find skilled workers is probably one of the positive sides of this labor story in the country. Now, moving on to the next slide, let's talk about the state policies, because they matter, and they matter a lot. So I place here 3 examples, because politics matter when it comes to incentives. So depending on your company sector, your location will be impacted by the state incentives. So we have 3 great examples that are varied. So we have Baja California, which is run by the Morena Party. Then you have Nuevo León by the Movimiento Ciudadano. And then you have Querétaro with the PAN. So we have 3 different examples. When it comes to Baja California, we have incentives that are targeted towards working training programs. We have incentives promoting maquila, but it is critical for the state to promote workers training as part of the positive spillover effects that foreign companies bring to the Mexican market. Now, when it comes to Nuevo León is heavily targeted towards the nearshoring opportunity, offering tax incentives, offering import and export incentives, and offering lower VATs for companies operating in Nuevo León. So that's very important, because we see a contrast. It is not so much focused about workers, but it's more about bringing companies to manufacture in the state. And finally, Querétaro is a really good example as well, because it's a top destination for aerospace. The aerospace industry is growing rapidly in Querétaro, and the government has been focused on the following. Okay, how can we generate partnerships with universities to train our workers so we have a skilled labor available to meet the demands of an aerospace technology sector that requires a skilled labor pool of talent. So that is very important. So when you're selecting, again, the state, and when you're looking at how Mexico is divided in the different regions, it's super important to look at the state incentives. Moving on to the next one. Let's look at the regional analysis, and this is where Chris comes in. So the floor is yours, Chris. So walk us through.
Diego, thank you so very much. Very briefly, why should you care why I have to anything I have to say? You've been with us for 90 minutes already. Thank you so much. The participation has been amazing to see. I'm going to have to hold your attention for a little over an hour talking about regional analysis and then the criminal and security risks in Mexico. So I'm Chris Dolby. I've been an investigative journalist for over a decade, focused on organized crime, most importantly in Mexico, where I lived for 8 years. I was the managing editor of Insight Crime, which does a lot of criminal investigations across Latin America. Some of you may have already read it. But last year, I made the fateful decision to stop being a journalist. Now, why was that? Because I was having more and more conversations, whether that be with investors, law enforcement, policymakers, who could see organized crime changing, adapting, not just being a background risk, not being a security hazard that they had to deal with, but becoming more and more a direct threat to their business, their sector, their supply chain. And who often didn't understand, A, how quickly those changes were happening, and B, how to even begin adapting to those security risks. So first, I published a book last year, CJ&G, A Quick Guide to Mexico's Deadliest Cartel. Why should you care about that? Because it tells you, it walks you through the eyes of the Jalisco cartel over 10, 15 years of the adaptation of cartels in Mexico, how they went from being, primarily marijuana, opium producers, then synthetic drugs, and now seeing extortion as a pillar of their criminal economies. Not just avocado farmers, not just chicken farmers, not just tortilla shops, but cargo trucks, but mining operations, but factories, but port terminals, who are all getting shaken down to the cost of hundreds of millions to billions of dollars a year. And more importantly, I began working with those investors to help them identify, many of them for the first time, why they should give a damn about organized crime in a wholly new way. Could we go to the next slide, please, Valley? So one of the most pervading sources of anxiety for companies is operational risks of the US-Mexico border. And Diego has very eloquently explained many of those. But heightened criminal activity in border regions is something that people really have to understand. The US-Mexico border is not only the world's most active trade corridor, it's also its deadliest migration route. It's the most busy frontier for drug trafficking, and it's the most busy frontier for human trafficking and migrant smuggling. Now, for decades, as I just mentioned, those two universes existed side by side. They would often clash with each other, but those clashes were often indirect. Now they're becoming direct. The rise in migrants crossing the border, the shift of the major cartels, not only from drug trafficking, but looking at cargo truck hijacking, at how those migrants can be criminalized and forced to cross the border, bring drugs across, participate in weapons trafficking. The chaos that has caused at checkpoints, the disruptions that this is bringing to legal trade routes. You're seeing border checkpoints often being disrupted or closed due to humanitarian and security issues. Closures are becoming more frequent, delays are becoming lengthier, and obviously that has a knock-on operational cost across the supply chain. And on top of that, now we're seeing cartels increasing the leverage on the other side of the border. At the Tijuana-San Diego border, at the Nuevo Laredo, Tamaulipas, Texas, we're seeing cartels where once violence was almost entirely confined on the Mexican side of the border. We're beginning to see a worrying trend of force projection across the border. Not force projection willy-nilly, but force projection and homicides on the American side of the border to protect business interests in Mexico. Why does that matter? Because those same closures and disruptions and knock-on effects on the supply chain outbound from Mexico are going to start becoming inbound from the US into Mexico if we don't adapt to them. Can we go to the next slide, please? So I've chosen two case studies, and my sections in part 2 and part 3 are going to be less about national statistics and more about painting a picture, snapshots of areas in Mexico which are the focal points for how security risk is beginning to encroach on business in new ways. Now, I've chosen Tijuana and Nuevo Laredo, both the US border, for two reasons. They are case studies of where nearshoring and cross-border trade were developing, while simultaneously these areas were battlegrounds for cartel influence, drug trafficking, smuggling of arms, smuggling of migrants. And we're going to look at how Claudia Scheinbaum on the investment side is actually balancing, to some extent, AMLO's policies with a more modern technocratic approach, as Alex and John pointed out, and her security policies, which cannot be worse than AMLO, who did next to nothing in terms of security. But the worrying thing with Scheinbaum's policies is that they're very reactive. They seem to be chasing the latest headline. They seem to be reacting to the latest violence hotspot instead of getting to the root of the matter. And we'll have a look at that in these two cities first. So Tijuana, just to set a picture, that is the busiest crossing for the US border. It's 200,000 vehicle crossings a day. It is by far the #1 crossing point for fentanyl and methamphetamine into the US. I don't mention heroin, I don't mention marijuana, I don't mention cocaine, because it's not that they're not relevant, but their importance has dwindled. Increased security measures are being pushed by both candidates, both presidential candidates, Harris and Trump, albeit in different ways, are calling for more security measures that could delay shipments and operations. Something there. Almost never, unless you're talking about a 9/11 level event, are you going to see security top trade as a priority on any length of time. Maybe for a couple of days around a major event or a major arrest or a major massacre. But Tijuana has only seen business increase, while the city is always among the most violent or among the most violent cities in Mexico. Now, what is the impact on business? We know already about increased security costs. We know already about logistics companies, cross-border trucking companies have already had this in mind. But now, when we see cargo theft going through the roof, to the tune of thousands of cargo trucks being hijacked every year, when we see extortion becoming systematic on the entire supply chain, and we will study later in this session how extortion has become very targeted, how they've weaponized state productive databases so they know what to target, they know which trucks to target, they know how much money to ask for. For foreign investors, those unstable environments necessitate a heightened risk mitigation strategy. Can we go to the next slide, please? Similarly, Nuevo Laredo is really a problem for cargo truck hijackings. It's a crossing that generates almost $800 million in monthly trade, and that has gone up year after year, despite increased cartel violence. But we're now reaching a problem in Nuevo Laredo. Nuevo Laredo is a very rare situation in the Mexican security landscape where there's one cartel, the Northeast cartel, that utterly dominates that city, begins to project that force across the Texan border, and doesn't face any major cartel rivals. Now, you would think that could be a positive thing, because usually when one cartel controls an area, there's less violence. Yes, but that cartel is then free to develop criminal economies with impunity, and the number one criminal economy that has been developed in Nuevo Laredo and the highways leading to it is cargo truck hijackings. AMLO did respond to this to a certain extent and sent the National Guard to Nuevo Laredo and to protect those highways. It led to some clashes. It led to a heightened body count. It didn't lead, apart from on a daily basis, to any meaningful disruption of those cargo truck hijackings. Next slide, please. Now, what does Claudia Sheinbaum want to do about all this? Right? As I was saying, she has put fiscal incentives to attract investment to northern border cities. That's a continuation on a different scale to the policies of almost every recent Mexican administration. She has spoken about building 100 industrial parks. She actually mentioned a point that Diego mentioned about building industrial parks outside of that golden triangle. But she hasn't acknowledged how, if you plan those industrial parks in areas where criminal groups are becoming more sophisticated, more savvy to how companies are operating, more savvy to what cargo trucks to hijack, more savvy to what level of extortion and what companies to target, more savvy to where the weak points are in individual supply chains, how are those industrial parks going to play straight into their hands? And cities like Tijuana and Nuevo Laredo, where we're beginning to see these lines blur between legitimate business and illegitimate business, it's a critical problem. She has this very forward-thinking policy, although a little bit pie in the sky, when it comes to these incentives, but her security strategy doesn't follow the same plan. It's still very reactive. It's still very based on essentially where are the cartels operating now, without thinking that obviously can change from year to year in Mexico. Last point I wanted to make: she has focused on security upgrades, particularly in Nuevo Laredo, where she acknowledges that cartel dominance is worrying. She's talked about increasing the military presence. She's talked about increasing border patrols along highways to discourage roadblocks and cargo theft. We'll have to see over time whether that makes a difference. But sending in the military has been let's say the red alarm pull for many Mexican presidents. The Mexican army has been saying for years that it is not trained to carry out these missions over any sort of time, right? Yes, it can go into a city and arrest a high-value target. Yes, of course, it can overwhelm armed opposition. But long-term, almost counterinsurgent work, dissuading criminal activity on a large area, that is not what either the Mexican army or the Mexican National Guard have been trained to do. So Claudia Sheinbaum has not addressed that issue. Next slide, please. However, even far away from the US-Mexico border, we see that so far, high levels of violence have not deterred foreign investors in key areas. The Bajío region accounts for 25% of Mexico's GDP. And the states that make up the Bajío region, like Guanajuato, which is the most violent state in Mexico, has been for the last 7 years, continues to see billions of dollars going into the automotive industry. Next door, Querétaro, ironically one of the safest states in Mexico, and we'll go into the reasons why in part 3, sees investment going to the aerospace industry. Querétaro is an aerospace cluster at roughly about the same growth rate as Guanajuato with its automotive industry and its colossal levels of violence. Now, what AMLO hoped, and he pointed to the Bajío regularly for this, what AMLO hoped is that he said that Mexico's economic promise was powerful enough to attract investors despite high levels of violence. We're going to see within the first 2 years of Sheinbaum's presidency whether that continues to be true. Because as organized crime moves from being this indirect threat to being a direct threat, has a much more prohibitively expensive impact on risk assessment, on risk mitigation strategies, and on the supply chain, that might begin to affect where in Mexico foreign dollars are going to go. Next slide, please.
And also on insurance premiums as well, Chris.
And absolutely on insurance premiums. Yeah. The Bajío is irregular. The Bajío is vital for nearshoring industrial operations. So you're going to see it essentially might be a soft ramp for the Bajío, especially for Guanajuato, because the infrastructure for automotive in Guanajuato is there. No other state in Mexico can compete with that for that specific industry. Similarly for aerospace in Querétaro. Similarly, of course, near ports. We'll go into this in part 3 as well. But ports are always going to see a measure of foreign investment because of their nature and because of their bottlenecks, despite whatever level of cartel violence. But there is an unknown in the next, I think, 18 to 36 months of, as all foreign companies begin to put much more attention on cartel violence as a direct threat, as often a personal threat, how is that going to affect the distribution of FDI across Mexico? And that's it from me on this section.
So next slide, please, Vale. Yeah. Before we go to a Q&A section, we just wanted to, as John pointed out, what's the checklist for companies when considering Mexico as an opportunity, as an alternative to reinvest, to produce, to manufacture? So first of all, I pointed out this throughout the presentation. It's critical, absolutely critical to look at the regions for your next location. So recently we did a study for a global logistics player that wanted to understand what should be my next location in Mexico. I have multiple facilities, but what should be my next location based on infrastructure, based on suppliers, based on potential partners? So looking at not the industrial parks that I should locate, but the actual region as an ecosystem, it's something that it is highly recommended. Also, identifying potential local partners, vendors, distributors, or acquisition targets. Companies need to be aware of the risks that they will face if they are not properly vetting the companies that they're working with as, let's say, transportation providers or partners, or the distributors that they're working with. Some companies are actually money laundering facades for the drug cartels, and it's critical for your organization to know who are you actually working with. Also, it's super important to understand from the point of view of your competitors, okay, how they're operating in this facility, how they're making it happen, what are their operational costs, what are some of the prices that they're able to charge to their customers, or the premiums that they have. So it's really important to also monitor your competitors and to have competitive intelligence in place to know what's going on with my top 3 competitors in the country, understanding what the size of my opportunity in terms of revenue or volumes. If you're a service provider, it's really important, especially if you're looking into Mexico as a platform to your services, for instance, for your logistics services, or if you're selling from the US or Europe into Mexico. And conducting enhanced reputational due diligence is critical, because as Chris pointed out, you need to know your suppliers, you need to know who your partners are, who your vendors are, and avoiding those risks could be one of the greatest strategies that you can follow in your planning session. I think this is a topic that has been coming on top of the discussions among the boards of directors, how we can mitigate risks, how can we better prepare supply chains for the potential disruptions that are occurring every single day. Last month was a port strike in the US. We are dealing with the Middle East conflict in Israel and Palestine, the Ukraine-Russia war. So how all those elements impact my supply chain, how the drug cartel activity impacts my supply chain in Mexico, those elements are coming front and center. So that is part of the checklist when you're considering market intelligence to make better decisions, because that's the beauty of the market intelligence, that you can make better decisions. So John, over back to you for the Q&A session.
Great. Fantastic, Diego, Chris. Very rich stuff. And not surprisingly, it generated a lot of interest from our audience. We have a number of questions. Gosh, where do we begin? So one of the things that we've talked about, and I've heard anecdotally in Mexico, is this huge wave of Chinese investment in Mexico, particularly setting up assembly operations, has slowed down because they're worried about US-Mexican relationships and how they might be targeted. And therefore, before they're going to make the move from China to Mexico, they want to see what's going to happen in the US elections and the policy-making priorities afterwards. So there's a couple questions about FDI. One sort of saying, you know, most of it's about reinvesting, but the Chinese investments being apart from that. What are your thoughts about what the Chinese see in Mexico? Are they still going to come? Are they pausing right now, as I've heard? Is that something you've heard, Diego? And what about the thinking of other investors, other industrial investors who want to see Mexico as a manufacturing base? Are they also putting their projects on pause right now, or are they continuing to go ahead? So distinguishing Chinese companies from, say, non.
Yeah, John. So the reality that I am seeing today is we are going through a difficult year, especially when it comes to foreign direct investment. We have elections in the US, we have elections in Mexico, and typically all over the world during election years, investments tend to slow down, investors tend to be more cautious. But as soon as you have clarity, money starts to flow again. So when it comes to the Chinese investors, what I've been getting across my studies is that they are on a wait and see pattern, especially with the risks of Donald Trump winning the election in the US. There will be probably a tougher stance approach when it comes to the Trump administration tariffs and leveraging tariffs as a potential disruptor in the relationship with Mexico and also with Canada. So on the Chinese side, that's a wait and see approach. On the rest of the manufacturing players, especially from Europe, I see a more positive view about Mexico. So let's remember that since we are in Mexico and in the US, we tend to get the gritty, needy details about what's going on. But when you look at the Europeans, they don't see all the risks and challenges that we're pointing out when it comes to the Sheinbaum administration. So there is a more positive view about Mexico because of that. But the reality is that in January of next year, we will start to see investments picking up again, especially the reinvestments that we have been discussing. New investments are still not as we wanted to see them, is still low. So the reality is that 2025 will bring more clarity in terms of the nearshoring opportunity. But in short answer, is a wait and see until we get the results of the US election.
Yeah, I would add to that this anti-Chinese sentiment coming out of the US, and while it's not defined, everybody's kind of a deer in the headlights. But as it becomes more defined, and if between the sort of trade law principles of these trade agreements versus the powers of the president to decree certain tariffs that don't collide with those trade agreements, we may see a policy framework that continues to punish China, including Chinese companies that are not properly compliant. So I see one is a set of tariffs directed against Chinese product coming out of China. I see another initiative to investigate the true certificate of origin of Chinese products assembled in Mexico and whether they're compliant with the USMCA. But otherwise, generally hands off on Mexico in the short term because there is a trade agreement protecting those rules. And number two, the Americans know that they need, even the MAGA Republicans understand that they need a cheap labor assembly partner to maintain the strength of the US economy. And if it's going to not be China and they're going to dissuade investment from China, they need Mexico. So if there's many scenarios out there. If it's done right from the point of view of sort of Republican mindset, this could favor Mexico in the longer term, but in the short term, it's bound to cause disruption. Now, there's a question about Taiwan I want to address. Taiwanese companies will not be included in this, but as you all know, Taiwanese companies have invested heavily in the PRC in the last 10 years. If their supply chain is deemed to be considered more mainland Chinese than it is Taiwanese, then they're going to be treated as if they're a PRC company. But if they're a true Taiwanese company where most of their value add is based in Taiwan, then I don't see them being thrown in the mix. Another question for you, Diego, is around the Inter-Ocean Corridor, which is this project whereby in southern Mexico they would build an alternative to the Panama Canal. The difference being is that this is also couples with the vision of the Morena Party to industrialize the South, bring wealth to the South. This is a hugely important voter base in Mexico, but has generally been much poorer than the north of Mexico. So is the Inter-Ocean Corridor realistic? What do you think? I mean, maybe in purely logistics terms not, but maybe under sort of economic development it might be. And I invite Alex and Chris to chime in on this as well.
Right. So my point of view is the following. The Interoceanic Corridor is not a competitor for the Panama Canal, and it will never be a competition. It's focused, and it's a reality. I think the government will be able to complete it in the next 3 to 4 years. We know that Mexicans tend to be not very productive when it comes to adhering to the timeframes of completion for these massive projects. The best example is the Dos Bocas refinery. So we will see delays, but in the next 3 to 4 years, we might see this operational. And the key element for this project is to industrialize and bring back jobs to the south of Mexico. So it's about creating a region that has abundant natural resources, that has abundant space as well, and that has the potential to serve companies through those two ports on the Gulf and the Pacific, with the mindset of serving directly customers. So you could reach your customers through ocean shipping without even passing through the roads in Mexico. And that is a key advantage for companies that think about the security concerns, that think about the congestions in the northern border. So the government has been very smart in developing that plan. And I think it's going to be a huge disruptor for the Mexican economy in the next 5 years. So I'm very positive on that. And I think that it will provide a boost for international firms operating in Mexico.
Just to add to that, because I'm completely in agreement with what Diego says, but in its current stage, even if it's at full capacity, the Corredor Transísmico, this corridor, is only about 5% of the Panama Canal's capacity. However, what's crucial here is the redundancy. I don't know if anyone's ever flown over Panama, but like just the traffic jams one sees in the ocean are incredible. And COVID showed us that you can't afford to have any logistical slip up, be it in the Suez Canal with Evergreen, or with the recent droughts in Panama, making the Panama Canal slightly more of a problem point for climate change. What's really important about the corridor is industrialization. You see the way that they're connecting the corridor to the electrical grid, for instance. And what you can see happening is a corridor of factories where you sort of have production going along as transport happens. So imagine you get a box full of European components in Coatzacoalcos, and then you manufacture them as you go down the corridor, and then you package them up at the end of that corridor and send them off to Asia.
Definitely. Chris, I think you were going to say add to our points.
It's early going, but organized crime in Mexico is very aware of the potential of the Interoceanic Corridor. They've, in the recent electoral campaigns, there were a lot of murders and threats of local officials in the municipalities close or leading to the corridor. Especially in areas where traditionally political violence was low, for example, Coatzacoalcos or Oaxaca. You're beginning to see a lot of local officials being in cahoots with criminal gangs. linked to oil theft, linked to extortion, linked to migrant trafficking in those areas. So I absolutely agree on the potential and the economic boom that could bring, but that is going to have to also tackle security and criminal risks. Essentially, now no mega project in Mexico will happen without taking those risks into major factors.
Definitely.
Yeah, the violence issue notwithstanding, this is not unlike what we saw in the development of China. So it began with 4 provinces near Hong Kong that had infrastructure, that had better educated people, but were still far from the traditional industrial corridors of China, which were in the north. But they created this, and just out of policy, and it had lower wages, et cetera, they're able to make it work. Now, Chinese government ability to implement policy versus Mexico's is another story altogether. But the point is that it's not a crazy idea. As the unemployment levels map that Diego displayed earlier, there's far more available labor in the south than there is in the north. That labor has traditionally gone to the north to work, but that's very disruptive to families, and they'd much rather stay at home. So this is definitely have potential. And we're ready for Chapter 3, Mexico Security Risks, led by Chris Dalby. Chris, the floor is yours.
Thank you so very, very much, John. So before we go on to the slides, I want to paint a picture of you. I want to paint the broad lines that make me confident in saying that Mexico is facing a security crisis and a criminal crisis unlike ever before. It is a security crisis that is very different to 2006, when President Calderon militarizes the conflict and sends those murder rates soaring up. It's very different to that period in 2011, 2012, when we were all worried about the Zetas and what they were doing to Mexico. Because today we have more cartels than ever before. Even the Sinaloa cartel, which was the linchpin of the Mexican drug trafficking world for 20 years, is fragmenting. What does that mean? Should we worry about that? Yes, we should absolutely worry about that. When, as we mentioned before, when there's one cartel dominant in one area, violence tends to go down. The Sinaloa cartel is an example of that. The states which it ruled, Sinaloa, Sonora, parts of Chihuahua, were not the most peaceful in Mexico, but they were far from the most violent. There were, of course, outbreaks of violence when they felt that they needed to show that, but by and large, they wanted a status quo in which they could do business, and that is where you see these decades-long relationships between the Sinaloa cartel or members thereof and the PRI, and even later with Morena. They were looking for that status quo. That is now crumbling, and it's crumbling just as Scheinbaum takes over. It's crumbling after 6 years of a very almost a dangerously lackluster approach to cartel security by AMLO. And this is what has emboldened the cartels more than ever before to go after foreign companies. One is they feel they can get away with it. That is the key thing. They feel they can get away with it, and there's thousands, tens of thousands of examples to prove to them that they can. Cargo truck hijackings on an individual scale are not going to provoke a massive police reaction, not going to provoke a manhunt or a prolonged investigation. Hell, murders don't do that, so a cargo truck hijacking doesn't either. But over time, when it comes to the same areas, when it affects the same companies, the losses amount to the billions. Second, you begin to see a necessity. All this cartel violence, all this cartel fragmentation has essentially made the barriers to entry to a lot of the illicit economies in Mexico even lower than they were before. It's now very possible for a splinter group of just a few guys to make fentanyl, to make meth, to have a contact in the diaspora or a contact in a gang in the US to make that sale, to smuggle it across the border in many, many ways, using often criminalizing migrants to do so. The barrier to entry is very low. One factor is the end of heroin and marijuana as the linchpin drugs. Those required agricultural knowledge. Those required expertise in farming. Those required, depending on the seasons. You can make fentanyl and meth absolutely anywhere you want, as long as you have the right chemical precursors. Extortion has now become, I would argue, in Mexico, as a domestic Mexican crisis, the most important criminal economy in Mexico, beyond drug trafficking, beyond drug production, because extortion is now beginning to paralyze cities. Chilpancingo, where the mayor Alejandro Arcos was tragically murdered a few days after Scheinbaum takes power. This is a regional capital, not far from Mexico City. I mean, the circumstances of his murder are brutal. But that murder was not about necessarily controlling the drug route. It was in part, but it was about controlling extortion in Chilpancingo. Chilpancingo is on the highway from Acapulco to Mexico City. It's an incredible product. It's an agricultural and productive hub. And we have seen in the last 5 to 10 years in Chilpancingo ridiculous levels of brutality connected to the extortion of sectors that to us might seem laughable. Specifically, chicken farming in Chilpancingo is now a reason to kill people because it is so lucrative as an extortion market. So what is the government doing? In his slide on the Mexican cabinet, Alex mentions one figure, Omar Garcia Harfuch. Garcia Harfuch is the new security secretary of Mexico, and he is the absolute #1 guy for Scheinbaum when it comes to fighting organized crime. He has a very successful track record. In Mexico City, he executes the plan that brings murders down by over 50%. He went after the Jalisco cartel in particular. He's an expert in going after the Jalisco cartel, went after El Mencho, went after El Menchito, and was almost killed for his work. He was shot 3 times while driving in broad daylight in Mexico City just a few years ago. So that is just the picture that I wanted to paint as we move into slide 3. Next slide, please, Vale. So we're going to stay on the Bajío for a second, and this is a little bit of a continuation of what we were talking about, and we're going to focus on one state, Guanajuato. And let me tell you a story. Why do I want to tell you this story? Because it shows you the evolution of cartels and how this factors into security risk analysis. When you understand the strategy of a cartel, when we break this lingering but damaging myth that every cartel in Mexico is the same, it's just a name and the top kingpins who change. Not at all. Every cartel in Mexico is different. Even though they're all motivated by money, they are motivated to get it in different ways. They have different competitive advantages, and they have different sectorial expertise. Guanajuato, violence in Guanajuato is centered around one thing: oil theft. There are other states in Mexico which have oil theft, Puebla notably, but in Guanajuato, it is the prime driver of violence and has been a driver of violence for 10 years. Let's go back a bit. 2011, the Jalisco cartel is created, and they rapidly see that to survive against the big boys, Sinaloa cartel, Tijuana cartel, they need to diversify. Now, they create themselves in Jalisco, which is not far from Guanajuato, just a couple of states to the west, and El Mencho sends his elite troops to Guanajuato to take over the oil theft racket. Now, that is almost a captive audience, because most of the oil theft racket and the product that is stolen stays within Guanajuato. You have a situation where you have a refinery, pipelines crisscrossing the countryside, local villages or local petrol stations, filling stations, quite happy to get cheap oil that has been stolen out of the pipeline or even refined into gasoline. So you have a constellation of little gangs working at a municipal level who, yeah, sometimes fighting, but at a low level, are dependent on this economy. It is a prime creator of jobs in a way. The theft of oil, Pemex has little to no ability to control it until the Jalisco cartel rolls into town. The Jalisco cartel rolls into town and simply tells all these little groups, okay, you work for us or you're dead. Simple. Some of the groups do cooperate and become members of the Jalisco cartel, and a few of them don't. A few of them, based in the town of Santa Rosa de Lima, create what becomes a new cartel and begin a war. Within 4 years of that start, Guanajuato goes from a mid-ranking state in the homicide rankings to #1 by a landslide because of oil theft. Not because of fentanyl, not because of meth, not because of extortion, but oil theft. AMLO comes in, and really the only sort of head fake he made towards a coherent organized crime strategy is he declares that oil theft is the #1 threat to Mexican national security. He sends thousands of troops into Guanajuato to patrol the pipelines. He actually stops for a while the supplying of oil through pipelines to petrol stations. It is entirely done by tanker truck. I leave you to imagine the losses and slowdowns that caused, because also the tanker trucks could easily be hijacked as well. Now we have about a decade of data on Guanajuato. Simply no government strategy has reduced the violence. It is every single year either #1 or #2 in the most violent states in Mexico. Its cities are the only place in Mexico, with maybe Tijuana, where I would commonly say are war zones. The mid-ranking cities of León, Celaya, Irapuato are war zones with thousands of deaths a year. And yet, those cities are critical supply hubs for the automotive industry that exists alongside the oil industry in Guanajuato. So automotive manufacturers are beginning to face incredible disruptions due to cartel extortion, security costs, and production holds. Why? Because now that the oil theft war has kept going, they're looking for new sources of financing, and extorting foreign companies that are there is just a logical next step to an enterprising cartel. Next slide, please. Now, when the Jalisco cartel moved into Guanajuato, as I said, they were facing a bunch of trumped-up oil thieves. You would have thought that a cartel with the reputation, the firepower, the membership, the money of the CJNG would mop up these little guys in a matter of months. Not at all. It's a conflict that has now lasted longer than World War II. Guanajuato has become synonymous with weekly or monthly clashes in the same, let's say, 12 to 15 little municipalities, because they are fighting for individual access to sections of pipelines. The government has ceased all patrols, almost all of them. And in fact, since the first year of AMLO, where we see a little dip in the number of oil taps, because he was literally patrolling or his army was literally patrolling the pipelines, oil theft and cartel violence have surged every single year. It's a rate by rate increase. 2024 might see a small dip for the first time in 6 years. Why is this important? Because this shows you that cartel violence is here to stay. Even though it might happen for reasons we don't anticipate, like here, oil theft, it's incredibly difficult to plan for a post-cartel future. In embedded areas like this, where there's a captive criminal economy like oil theft, that cartel violence can go for years. So when you begin to factor this into your risk strategies, when you begin to factor this into your supply chain management, understand this is a long-term investment. It's not a temporary band-aid. It's a radical rethink in the way that companies in the Bajío are planning their operations. Next slide, please. Now, again, this is going to sound a little bit similar to what I said about Tijuana and Nuevo Laredo, but I want to drive the point home. There is a clear difference, and Alex and I published a joint piece about this a couple of weeks ago, between Scheinbaum's investment planning, which, while, as you heard from John, Alex, and Diego, far from perfect, does show a little bit of forward thinking, does show a little bit of modernity, does show a little bit of influence from the more technocratic sides of her government. Scheinbaum, when she sort of upgraded from mayor of Mexico City to mayor of New York, to president of Mexico, I apologize, was thinking about how can I apply the same strategies that worked in Mexico cities, some of them which were pulled from New York, Oakland, California, which reduced violence in urban settings. How could I apply that to the Mexican national context? Simple answer, it cannot be done. The root causes of violence in Bajío is oil theft. In Tijuana, it's controlling of the border. In Michoacán, is control of agricultural, of drug plantations, of fentanyl farms. In Puerto Vallarta and Cancun, it's control of the tourism industry and local drug sales. In Chiapas, it's control of the migrant trade and the drug trade coming up from Guatemala. So while the manifestations of violence might look the same, the root causes are different. I have seen nothing in Scheinbaum's plan or in Harfuch's speech, which makes me feel they understand that needs to be addressed individually. It's an incredibly tough ask, and I understand why after AMLO they might say, you know what, this is not something we're going to worry about. But in Bajío, where it's been going on for almost a decade, in Bajío, where, yes, for now, foreign investment continues to rise, I think we're going to see that disruption within the next couple of years. Scheinbaum wants to enhance transportation infrastructure. She wants to improve connectivity, so she wants to increase the number of highway and even rail connections to the Bajío. Without strategic thinking, that is only going to increase cartel presence, because cartels systematically in Mexico fight over those transport hubs. They fight over those infrastructure hotspots, big highway crossings, railway crossings, where they have an opportunity, more opportunities now, to contaminate trains, to contaminate trucks, to extort them, to hijack them. And there's no mention at all in her security plan about oil theft. This, to me, was staggering. She mentions it as a cause of violence in Mexico, but there's no plan to offer economic alternatives, to offer vocational training to the communities that are utterly dependent on oil theft to survive. There's no thought about working with the private sector that is utterly embedded in Guanajuato, that is a generator of thousands, if not tens of thousands of jobs in that region, to think, okay, how can we begin to reach out to the populations that the economic boom in Guanajuato has not benefited yet, or has not benefited as much as it could. Nothing of that. And yet these are policy plans that have been on AMLO's desk, on Peña Nieto's desk, on Fox's desk, going back well over a decade. So again, we see a disconnect between the security reality and the economic potential to address that reality. Next slide, please. Now, let's talk about Mexican ports. Very simple slide because, again, much like Bajío, Tijuana, or Laredo, I want to focus on 4 ports without necessarily the same level of depth. But these 4 ports are important for different reasons. These ports, Ensenada, right near Tijuana, Manzanillo and Lázaro Cárdenas on the Pacific, and Veracruz on the Atlantic, are critical hubs for international trade, for Mexico's internal economy, and as criminal hotspots. Let's look at Ensenada. Ensenada, just south of Tijuana, has been a battleground between the Sinaloa cartel, the Tijuana cartel, and the Jalisco cartel, going back years. Sinaloa has usually dominated, but it is such a critical hotspot that Tijuana and Tijuana cartel and the Jalisco cartel have used Ensenada to receive shipments of chemical precursors, fentanyl, and to send out from that port mostly wildlife and forestry goods. So even when there's a dominant cartel like Sinaloa, a port is such a complicated environment, so difficult to control holistically, that other groups can find a way to penetrate. Manzanillo and Lázaro Cárdenas, I'm sure you've heard of the insane hauls that are made of chemical precursors coming in from China, right? The China dependence on China and its very sort of far west chemical industry, the tens of thousands of companies that pump out chemicals there, mean that cartels are able to vary their supply route, their supply deals, but it all gets funneled in to those 2 ports. In July, there was an 88-ton seizure of chemical precursors in Manzanillo. So AMLO again says he sent the army in 2020, increased inspection of containers, but that has not made a dent. We know that cargo inspections at ports are very cursory, and that is often mandated by the market. Private companies, shipping companies get very antsy when you want to pause either one of their ships or their containers or their trucks to do a complete search. So that essentially never happens, despite these being arguably the most critical hubs for the most dangerous drug ever produced, fentanyl. And now we look at Veracruz. Now, Veracruz is interesting because Veracruz 10 years ago, 7 years ago, was very violent. And while still in the top half of the rankings, it went down a little bit. The Zetas that controlled Veracruz disbanded in about 2014, 2015. And since then, no single group has been able to control that port. But the Chinese are getting a little bit antsy when it comes to chemical precursors. There is beginning to be a response from the US. There's beginning to be joint pressure from the US, from the Mexican government, from the Chinese government to work together to stop those chemical precursors coming out of China. It's still a long way from being 100% effective, but what we've seen in the last couple of years is that the global chemical industry is beginning to be targeted by the Sinaloa and CJNG cartels that are looking to diversify their means of getting those precursors into Mexico. And a lot of them are coming in through Veracruz because they're now buying chemicals from India, they're buying chemicals from Brazil, they're buying chemicals from Germany, Ireland, the UK, all over Europe. Yes, it's a small but growing percentage compared to what's coming in from China. But Veracruz in the next 2 to 4 years could become, certainly during Scheinbaum's mandate, could become a new focus for US attention because suddenly the chemical precursors that lead to fentanyl that kill 100,000 Americans a year are coming in on the Atlantic side, not just the Pacific side. So this is just to get you thinking about how these permanent monolithic hubs for trade are very adaptable criminal focuses of violence. Next slide, please. Now, let's talk about the nitty-gritty here. The port of Manzanillo and the port of Lázaro Cárdenas are prime generators of violence, both inside ports. It is, I mean, I did research in both those ports last year, and I was speaking to dock workers, I was speaking to customs inspectors, I was speaking to even the port captaincy, and they told me that despite assurances of security, despite the presence of the military or the National Guard, if you are approached by insert organized crime group here and asked to cooperate or to look away or to help contaminate a container, and you say no, you have 24 hours to get out of town or you'll be killed. That's not systematically true, but it's true often enough inside those ports that you essentially have complete coercion, complete cooperation from almost every private and public actor in the port. The personal cost of resisting is simply not worth it. What does that mean? That means that more groups converge on the port because they see it as a soft target. Manzanillo is very close to the city of Colima, the capital of the state of Colima. Almost a very, very, very high percentage of the cargo that leaves the port of Manzanillo transits through Colima. So when the Mexican military went there, one deterrent impact was it reduced the amount of efforts to seize the precursors or seize the illicit goods inside the port. They would then wait for the container to leave the port, and they would offload the cargo outside the port. What that meant, of course, is that since criminal groups are not stupid and follow each other, the impact on cities and highways for cartel on cartel violence went through the roof. In 2000 to 2021, we see a 900% spike in murders related to the drug trade and to control of chemical precursors in Colima. It lasts for about 18 months, but for that 18 months, Colima becomes the most violent city in the world, beating out the cities in Guanajuato. Again, a single hub generating such violence that for a limited period of time, or a longer period of time, if you look at Tijuana, that city becomes the deadliest place on earth for a while. Now, there's always cartel, let's say, divisions and fragmentations in the background that you can try and look at, but that's very difficult and very nebulous to try and understand. What you do need to look at when you are planning supply chain routes, when you're working with a new transport company, when you're planning for an expansion of operations of import-export through one of these ports, is you have to plan, okay, how does that expansion, how does that change of partner, how does that new supply route increase or decrease our chance to be a target for criminal activity? Because, as we'll see in a second, the soft control of the port means that the cartels who run that port, which is largely the Jalisco cartel for Manzanillo and Lázaro Cárdenas, have access to all the shipping records. They have access to all the databases, the productive databases to which logistics company, which foreign owner owns a container, what's inside each container. They have access to those manifests. In 2022, this is one of the scariest levels of penetration. They detected that the CJNG had key logging software in the control room for the port of Lázaro Cárdenas, which means that they could detect every keystroke made by every operator inside that control room. So passwords, operational intelligence, they had access to the mapping of the database. Now that was seized, that keylogger was seized. I don't doubt that it took a matter of weeks or months for the next keylogger to be in place. So consider that any information that is part of those port records is probably in the hands of cartels, and they could certainly use it. Next slide, please. Now, as I said, AMLO's deployment to the military since 2020 has utterly failed to curb violence. The problem is, again, I hate to be ringing this alarm bell over and over again, say there's a lot of debts that are likely to come due in Scheinbaum's term. One is that ports are simply no longer going to be able to operate at a competitive level. Mexican ports are already very low down the competitive index when you look at their rivals in Latin America. And a lot of that is that cartel influence has only increased the last quarter of a century, right? AMLO ordered military takeovers of ports in 2020. He did it again in 2023 when he ordered the Army and the National Guard to every port and airport. It's a knee-jerk reaction that simply fails. Because a port, especially a port of this size, is so complex. There are so many ways to corrupt a person. There's so many ways to get a container moved to a dark area of the port where it's not going to be inspected. There's so many ways to get around container scans, to get around cybersecurity, that the operational delays, the increased costs, the financial losses that AMLO is trying to prevent only kept going up. Next slide, please. Now, President Scheinbaum simply wants to do more of the same. She wants to modernize Mexico's ports. She wants to streamline customs. She wants to put more cameras on ports. But as we know, if your control room is entirely monitored by cartels, if they have access to every keystroke that is being made in that control center, if they have access to every productive database, this I highly doubt is going to have an impact on reducing violence. So sadly, in ports, it's likely to be more of the same and likely to get worse through Scheinbaum's term in office. Next slide, please. Now, another impact, and this is not just in Mexican ports, is how licit and illicit supply chains have become completely intertwined. And I'm not just talking about how cocaine is hidden into inside containers of any cargo goods on the planet, often fruit, but the ports are also an export base for forestry, for mining products, for wildlife products, and there we see a very cunning working of the supply chain, working with import-export companies that are shell companies or front companies, working with customs officials who know very well how to meld and blend, essentially launder the illicit cargo and make it seem licit. Mexican ports officially have a role in checking those cargo manifests and running that up the supply chain and making sure that it hasn't been doctored. That simply never happens. Port security is essentially non-existent in Mexico, and usually when they make seizures, it's based on US intelligence or on getting lucky. So imagine that the supply chains that you depend on from these ports as trucking, rail, and air networks are all essentially suffering that pressure from a cartel system that has completely taken over, or not taken over, but has completely intermingled itself into the supply chain, where you don't know when the cargo is legitimate, when the cargo is illegitimate, and what little structures exist in place publicly in Mexico to attend to that don't work. Again, reinforcing the need for very specific audits, very specific choices when it comes to supply chain, and enhanced due diligence, which we'll talk about at the end of this session, on to prove yourself against cartel influence. Next slide, please. Right, now let's talk about a subject that interests all of us. Port violence is directly correlated to the thousands of truck hijackings that we've seen, especially in the last 3 years. Right. So far, I believe this was until the end of August, 5,140 cargo thefts in 2024. In total number, only about 400 or 500 more year on year than there were in 2023, and about 700 to 800 more than there were in 2022. What is dangerous, however, is the percentage of these becoming violent. The overwhelming majority of cargo thefts are now violent, where drivers, even if they cooperate fully, are being killed, are being hurt, are being pistol whipped, are being beaten up, sometimes killed, trucks being burned, or the entire truck being stolen. What does that tell us? That tells us that originally there was still some uncertainty among cartels as to how truck hijackings were going to work. What sort of a reaction was it going to provoke? Were you going to see the same or at least some US pressure to protect the supply chains? Were you going to see AMLO being crazy like in his first year in office with putting the army on the pipelines and sending convoys to escort critical cargo? None of that materialized. Mexico in a few years has become the highest risk country for cargo truck hijacking in the world. I'm currently in Senegal, West Africa, which Nigeria, Senegal, Mali were far beyond Mexico for risks to truck cargo. Mexico now trounces all of them. It's not a foolproof solution, but we do see companies beginning to be aware of real-time route monitoring, partner audits, and each company now, or a lot of Fortune 500 companies at least, are putting in place security heat maps across Mexico to protect their supply chain. I think Diego wants to come in.
Yeah, I actually wanted to add the fact that the most targeted products right now are foods, beverages, and liquor, especially on the northern border. And the reason for that is because drug cartels and organized crime can easily resell those products in the black market. So in like 5 years ago, I remember that the most targeted products were high-tech, electronics, but now things are changing because the modus operandi has changed. So they get rid of these trucks that they stole, and then they move these products real quickly. So recovering those products is really challenging. And the reality is that the ticket value of those products is becoming smaller and smaller because it's easier to be resold in the black market.
Valentina, can we move forward 2 slides, please? Now, maybe you think, and by the way, this is hubris that I have heard from country managers in Mexico. Is you might think, well, what? No one's stolen my trucks, no one's hijacked my stuff. Why should I worry? Well, look at this, right? Amazon, DJI, drones, Danone, water jugs. That's actually 1.6 million water jugs. Pepsi, snacks, $1 million of iPhones, soap, Corona beer, anything that can be resold. The commonality of all of these items is they can be resold. This is just a smattering of the worst, or to give you a cross section of the fact that every type of cargo can be hijacked. It's essentially a parallel development to extortion, which we're going to come to in a minute. Extortion used to be focused on the products that the cartels understood how they worked. So avocados, for example, or limes, or fisheries, industries that were centuries old in Mexico, where these cartel members had grown up with these industries and had an understanding of them. Now, when you get access to productive databases and you know the value of the cargo, you know the route they're going to travel on, you know the specific truck they're going to have along, hell, you might even know the identity of the driver. It's Disneyland. It's Christmas morning. Next slide, please. Now, no, sorry. No, forward, please. Exactly. So now, how does this manifest in 2024? Cargo truck hijacks are going up, although, as I mentioned, although the violence is going up very rapidly as a percentage, the number of truck hijacks is staying not steady, but it's going up by a few percent every year. Because we're now in a post-cargo truck hijacking world in Mexico, where cartels have understood, well, we could hijack the trucks, and we'll continue to do that, certainly at a big level in certain parts of Mexico, but we can now offer protection rackets. We can now go to major operations, major factories, major mining sites, major port terminals, major trucking companies, go to their offices and say, okay, so you've had X hundred number of trucks in your company hijacked in the last year. Would you like that to stop? Well, that's going to bring us X number of money. This is what you're going to pay us. Right? So extortion rackets, where companies are simply paying extortion fees because it's the cost of doing business, is increasing. And that's something new. That was something that you saw with foreign companies, miners operating in very specific parts of Mexico, right? If you were operating deep in the mountains of Guerrero, or you were running a tourism operation deep in Michoacan or in somewhere on the Riviera Maya, you might have been doing that 10 years ago, but it was almost unheard of. Now it's becoming almost standard practice in large parts of Mexico. It's essentially an unofficial tax, and yeah, it's becoming part of your balance sheet. Next slide, please. Now, I want to talk a little bit about how this extortion model works, because it's really insidious. And I'm going to take avocado farmers as an example that we think we've all heard of. Let's imagine that you are the mayor of Uruapan, one of the big avocado municipalities in Michoacan, and you've just been elected, and someone knocks on your door 4 days into your mandate and says, it's not plata o plomo like Escobar used to say, but it's okay. Obviously, you need to work with us to survive. We want access to 10, 20, 25% of your municipal budget for the year. Just give that to us. On top of that, we want every single state productive database for every single town in the municipality. So then you understand, then if you're a cartel extorter, you understand each farmer, how many trees he has, how many avocados he produces, so you can shake him down on an exact margin of his profits. Then later, when it's harvesting season, you know exactly the kilos, the tonnage that he has produced. You extort him again, take a cut of the value of his crop. Then the avocado goes to packaging. You work with the packaging plant, and you know how many trucks of avocado is going to roll out of that packaging plant. You extort them again, either at the plant level or at the truck level. So 3 times in sort of, let's say, one harvest cycle, the cartel is going to take their due. It got so bad that US avocado imports were halted in 2022. Now, is Scheinbaum addressing this? Avocado extortion has been one of the most famous examples of extortion in Mexico going back well over a decade. Not a mention. What does she mention in her plan? Lime extortion. Now, lime extortion is almost a carbon copy of how avocado extortion works, but why did she mention limes and not avocados? Lime are obviously a Mexican staple just as much as avocados. Well, you look at the headlines, and a month before she came to power, or 6 weeks before she came to power, lime farmers went on strike because cartel extortion had become so bad they could no longer work. They went into Chilpancingo, into Morelia, into cities in Michoacán, even into Mexico City, threw boxes of lime onto the street, made a protest. The outgoing government of AMLO said they would look into it. They went back to work. In her security plan for 100 days, she specifically mentions the protection of lime farmers. It is the only industry that she specifically calls out. Why? Again, it's reactive. She's chasing that latest headline. She is responding to whatever the headlines are at that moment. I believe that if the avocado farmers had made a song and dance 6 weeks pushing powers, avocados would have been in her security plan, not limes. Next slide, please. Now we arrive at mining. Mining has been a staple of foreign investment in Mexico, obviously for well over 2 centuries. But Canadian mining companies, French mining, I used to edit the Mexico Mining Review, so I talked to a lot of mining CEOs and country managers, and they tell me in Zacatecas, in Guerrero, in Chihuahua, in the Tarahumara, extortion is now a standard, and that wasn't the case 10 years ago. It cost them millions. So far, mines have actually closed temporarily or suspended operations. Pan American Silver, a reference in Mexican mining, has halted operations at a key mine and frozen plans to expand. That was a lightning bolt for the mining industry of Mexico. When one of the market leaders says, no, cartel theft and extortion is so bad that we're going to suspend operations or suspend expansion. So you can begin to ward this off with on-site security, but what's much more important, we're going to talk about this in a second, is contractor vetting, is significantly increasing the way in which, or deepening the way in which you do due diligence. Let's continue. We've already expanded the slide. Please, let's move on. Right, last point to mention. This is only going to get worse because this extortion model is now going to be copied by every group that's coming up in Mexico. The implosion of the Sinaloa cartel only increases the risks for foreign companies across the country. The yellow areas, it says Pacifico because in Mexico we call Sinaloa cartel Cartel de Pacifico. The yellow states are the states that were key states for the Sinaloa cartel, where we're rapidly going to see an impact from their civil war and their fragmentation. But they're all over the country. To a minor extent. They are all over. They're in Riviera Maya, they're in Cancun, they're in Chiapas, they're in Veracruz. And in all of those areas, if the Sinaloa Federation is no longer paying people, we're going to see a fragmentation and an increase in the number of groups that are going to try and extort and hijack trucks and threaten the supply chain. Next slide, please. So I'm going to end my session with something that World of Crime has been developing, which is criminal due diligence. There's a 9-step plan that we've developed, but here's the background. Here's the gist of it. The gist of it is that background checks in Mexico are easy to dodge. It's not enough to check someone's judicial records. It's not enough to check whether a company's tax records. You now need to conduct much more thorough background checks into every person that you know is connected to that company. You need to be checking not only a company, but its holding company, the holding company, any changes of names, any changes of address, any bank accounts against government watch lists. US, Mexico, UK, Canadian sanctions databases are free online. Some companies are already doing this, but too few. Run those names against company sanctions. There was a case quite recently where I was brought in on a deal where a French company investing in Mexico, I won't mention the sector, was partnering up, was looking to having a multi-million-dollar contract with a Mexican supplier. This is in Oaxaca, and paid about $200,000 to the supplier, and everything vanished. The whole company went dark, website went dark, bank account went dark. It took 45 minutes. Google and one sanctions database to find not the supplier, not their holding company, but the ownership, the holding company was on a US Treasury watch list for cartel money laundering. Right there, 45 minutes. Investigate the supply chain. This obviously is due diligence 101, but it has to be much more thorough and much more criminal in mind. Who are their third-party providers? Who are the major suppliers of your supply or suppliers of your potential M&A? Look for their connections to transnational organized crime. Look for arrests and sanctions on their people and on the major personals in their supplies. Review finances. Again, this is an extension of normal due diligence. Zero in on usual cash flows. Zero in on offshore dealings. Where is that money going? are the financial tools that they're using connected with organized crime. That doesn't necessarily red flag on its own. Plenty of businesses use legitimate financial techniques to avoid offshore profits, for example. But if you see yellow flags in several of these areas, that all amounts to a big red flag across the board. And then, in the interview process, in the vetting process, talk to the company, talk to the supplier about their experience in dealing with organized crime. Have they been targeted for truck hijackings? Right? If they're operating in a sensitive area, too much peace can be a bad sign. Too much peace can mean that they're working with the wrong people. And I'm going to pause it there and turn it back over to John for the Q&A.
Thanks so much, Chris. Wow, it's so evocative what you talked about, and I think the most important part of it is that everybody is exposed to security risk at one level or another, whether it's even if your business is essentially digital, if your business is essentially a service-oriented business, the protection of key data and the reputational risk that can come if your customer lists or your vendor lists are somehow stolen, which have a value and have a market value and can be resold, exposes you to that risk. So very, very eye-opening. We have a lot of questions. I know that you identified some of them, Chris, ahead of time because they were already there an hour ago. So let me start with one of the ones that and this is a fairly broad question, but how are multinationals today dealing with the impact organized crime is generating on logistics? Because as you know, most multinationals that source or export from Mexico don't transport that product themselves, but rely on third-party logistics providers to do it. But please go ahead and answer that one.
I would broadly break it down into three categories. I think you do have multinationals who are on top of this and who have already gamed in protection of their supply chain. So even, yes, if they're working with third-party logistics providers, they feel committed to, obviously, from a financial perspective, to protect their supply chain, but also to help their partners ward themselves against cartel protection. So you do have multinationals now that have created, for example, alert systems on their entire supply chain, where any actor within any link in the chain can pull the alarm cord and say, "Hey, I've received a threat, or there's a suspicious activity, or there's a suspicious payment, or this container is likely hot." You have, let's say, and I would say the middle ground, the second category is probably where most are. You have companies that are now beginning to weigh up the risks and are weighing them up nationally, and are still waiting or are still gauging how it affects them in different parts of Mexico. Because if you're moving cargo, even with third-party providers, from, say, Acapulco or Manzanillo all the way to the US-Mexico border, you're going to be exposed to 4 different hotspots. And those 4 different hotspots are going to work in different ways with different cartels. So that complexity, the mapping out of that complexity, hasn't happened yet for a lot of multinationals. And then third, and this is to me very sad, you have multinationals who simply are turning a blind eye to it. Some because they haven't necessarily been exposed yet to a level where they're worried about it, or some, and this has actually been told to me directly, some essentially, we don't care. It's not a percentage of our cargo sufficient enough to trouble us, and the protection of cargo is the responsibility of our third-party provider. They don't see it as a team effort against organized crime. Right.
Now, I don't know if you've seen any sort of quantitative studies out there that try to measure what the violence, the threat of violence, and obviously the security measures taken by logistics companies operating in Mexico are way and above what the measures that they employ in many other parts of the world. So that bears a cost as well. So the actual cargo threat, the insurance cost increases, the security protocol cost increases. Any idea what that does to the cost of goods sold of Mexican exports, to what, is there a percentage number out there by which they're increased?
So the last data that I trust was in 2021, where it was estimated that the economic impact of crime and violence on Mexico in terms of total losses was $192 billion. And they talked about a 3 to 5% increase on certain goods, on customer goods to the US. Avocados, for example, is a key example, right? Where industries that have been repeatedly extorted are obviously going to pass that cost on to the customer. So you do see massive cost increases of avocados to the tune of 7 to 8% in 2021 when avocado extortion was at its worst right after COVID, where that was directly traceable to an increase in the demands that extortionists are making on avocado. On different industries, on heavier goods, on industrial goods, no, I don't have that level of data. It's likely going to come out at some point, but I think that 3 to 5% range is an accurate gauge.
Yeah, that aligns with, I wrote a book, oh gosh, a long time ago now, 2007, 17 years ago, that talked about the cost of security in Mexico. And between the additional security protocols that are taken, the loss of life, the loss of production out of the people who are injured or whose lives are taken by crime, as well as the sort of opportunity cost of lost foreign direct investment by companies that find it, too unappetizing, represented about 5% of GDP. So the 192 billion that you mentioned is somewhere around 7% of GDP. So now, just to put that in perspective, the US, which has the largest military in the world and spends more money, spends 51% of the world's global spend on formal military spending, so spends more money than all other countries in the world combined, spends 3.5% of GDP on military. So Mexico, the cost of security in Mexico is double that of the cost of US military spending to the US economy in terms of percentage-wise. So that just shows you just how big of an issue this is. And as you really pointed out, politicians it's almost like the third rail now in politics. It's the only politician who really took this on, full frontal attack, was Calderon, and he was excoriated for it. Violence ballooned. A lot of innocent people who were caught in the crossfire were killed. And Mexicans showed that they didn't have the political appetite for what it takes to stop cartel violence. And since then, and preceding Calderon, there hasn't been the political will to really take it on. Do you see a change now that organized crime really penetrates, first of all, so many lines of business and penetrates so much more of the economy than it used to? Do you see public outrage strong enough to give politicians the leeway to go the extra mile in their fight against these guys? Or do you still see this as an issue that politicians are going to try to minimize and stay away from?
It's on the brink because the American Chamber of Commerce, industry associations have been screaming blue murder about this for years. There is increased private security, investment on private security, on advanced analytics. Several security companies, some that work with World of Crime, have data centers or monitoring centers in Mexico City where they monitor, thousands of trucks in real time for clients. But that's at a huge private cost. There's very little integration and centralization of these efforts into even a preliminary government policy. So there is more and more outcry that hasn't yet translated into federal action. At a state level, we have seen prosecutors. So, for example, the state of Mexico, which is far the worst for cargo truck hijacking, things have got so bad that in Q1 2024, they really started investing on a rapid response team that was going to help companies deal with that. I've seen that deployed a few times, but it seems to be on a very ad hoc basis. So early days yet.
If I might.
Okay. Please.
Just a quick addition. There are political costs to organized crime violence. It's just the threshold is very, very high or low, however you want to put it. A really interesting case study, an extreme one, is Sinaloa politically a year ago had, as compared to the rest of the states, the second highest approval rating of AMLO across every state in the country. Now it's the second lowest right now. So it shows how when it completely gets out of hand and the state is seen to be responsible for a lack of security, there are political costs. Sinaloa is just one case, though. And the issue is the government is sort of stuck between a rock and a hard place here. Because on one side, there is, of course, a democratic sort of volition to not want to go out and do the full Bukele. But on the other side, people do seem to want mano dura. They don't want, for example, the Morena politician who suggested you might talk to criminals was completely thrown overboard by his own party and by public opinion. So it's a difficult sort of line to walk, I think, from the government's perspective.
It's a great point. And from the perspective, as someone who's not an expert in security, but certainly have witnessed it over years, from anecdotally, what I've heard is, first of all, the Sinaloa cartel, up until its recent implosion, was actually the most sort of stable business partner in the region. Yeah. And I mean that, not jokingly. Mining companies that I've dealt with would tell me that they felt more confident in the security accords that they had reached with the Sinaloa cartel in terms of maintaining open access to roads so they could export their ores, so they could bring in equipment, et cetera, so they could move their workers to and from their mining sites, were a lot more reliable than similar accords they might reach or similar protections that might be offered by the police. And that the leadership of Sinaloa was consistent and stable. And they ran a very complex international business, and stability was an important part of their business operandi. Another anecdote that really spoke to me was I went to give a talk in Cuernavaca, and I got picked up by a guy from the Mexico City airport. So we had a 2-hour drive together. And as he explained, before Calderon, there was one mafioso that ran the organized crime in Cuernavaca. And they were so effective that if, some couple of punks beat someone up one night or were involved in robbing a store, like good mobsters, they would step in and punish those petty crimes. And there was actually, petty crime was very low in the city. Well, when Calderon's Plan de Mexico came in, which was built after the Colombian plan, where you knock out the heads of these cartels, then it splintered into 5 or 6 competing organized criminal groups, much smaller, much less sophisticated, and fighting for turf, the turf being Cuernavaca. The city became much more violent. All of which tells me is organized crime is a lot easier to stomach when it's consolidated and when it's stable. And when it's splintered, which is a necessary step to go through on the way to defeating organized crime, that's when Mexican support for these measures falls apart. You can't take on organized crime, or at least maybe you can, Chris, maybe you've got a solution to take on organized crime without breaking it. But when you break it, you get this splintering and fragmentation. And it's that fragmentation that's dangerous and volatile and violent, and where the political support falls apart. What do you think about that, Chris, about that sort of line of thinking?
I think that the only way to deal with organized crime is to strangle it financially. It is the only thing that has worked around the world. Ratcheting up the body count doesn't work. It just changes the nature of organized crime, and it changes the response that you get. I see a question here about the National Guard. The National Guard has so far been a glorified border guard and has not been deployed in any meaningful way or as part of a cohesive strategy. I will give one credit to Sheinbaum. Sheinbaum has spoken about blending a militarized approach when necessary with an approach on socioeconomic investment and let's say a more humanistic approach. This is something that I explore at length in the book, is that we have to defeat organized crime, we have to understand where it comes from. And cartel members don't wake up in the morning, twirl their mustache and go, ha ha ha, how many people am I going to kill today? It's not that. It's a series of economic and social decisions that they have made to make their lives better. I've interviewed a narco, one of the worst in Michoacan, who was killed about 3 weeks after I interviewed him. And I asked him, why did you start selling drugs? And he said, to buy a house for my mum. I mean, it's an impulse that we can all understand. Of course, then he went down a horrifying path. It's not about forgiving these people. Absolutely not. These people deserve to be punished for what they've done, and sometimes that requires a violent response. But the state that we're at in Mexico, the state of penetration of cartels, of cartels being a fixture in Mexico, just like the Italian mafia are in Italy or were in America for many decades. They are so embedded into the mechanism of state that I don't see how the state can begin to tackle them, because they are a fundamental component of that state. I see Alex nodding, which is actually a very nice validation of this point. The way you go after them is financial. Because yes, crypto, yes, international money laundering, yes, black peso money exchange, yes, much of the money laundering goes to China. But the way in which they move money is still relatively limited and still well understood. There is simply no desire or instructions or coordination for long-term financial investigations. There's none, not in the US, not in Mexico. That's not how you build careers if you're a cop. That's not how you build careers if you're a prosecutor. You build careers over putting guys in jails and seizing drugs. And sadly, as long as that's the logic, foreign companies are going to continue paying the cost.
Alex, you're on
mute.
Sorry about that. Yes. An interesting point about the National Guard is because it's been removed from the control of the civilian security ministry under Harfuch, one of the big pushes he's been making, and it's very clear, is the creation of an intelligence apparatus very much aimed at least in theory and in terms of the speeches, at tracking the financial operations of organized crime. It's mildly sinister to an extent because it's the creation of this new spy network. And so it's military versus spies in the Mexican state. But it does seem like he's got at least an understanding that that's where you tackle crime, especially when the guns that Calderon, for example, used to tackle organized crime initially not only didn't work, but they're now out of his control. And so this is a way of him to exert power, but also maybe accidentally in a way that might actually be effective.
Alex, while we've got you, quick question. Well, maybe not such a quick question. I'm gonna enhance the question and ask, how could the implementation of judicial reform and a new highly politicized judicial system affect business and investment in Mexico?
So like the very first thing is lots of companies who can afford it are just simply moving to arbitrage. One of the biggest issues with the current judicial reform as it stands is that it's basically an unknown. So as Diego mentioned, uncertainty is massive right now. So they just want to take themselves out of the equation. There is a big worry that because judges will be elected and they'll be very much beholden to the political system, that justice will become politicized. But I think more worrying than that in the short and medium term is the fact that not even the government seems to understand how this new system is going to work. It's very much a first on the world stage at this level. And so as Diego said again, companies are very much on a wait and see pattern, but they're doing what they can. And so they're removing themselves as much as they can from the judicial system at great expense to themselves.
Okay. And
John, John, I like to add.
Diego, go ahead.
Yeah, I like to add one point, and it links very well with what Chris was saying, and is the fact that if you're threatened, if you're blackmailed, or you're offered money to change the verdict, as the system operates today, it has been a challenge for companies to actually uphold the judicial decisions. And when you think about how easily could be manipulated a judge that is elected by popular vote, that requires financing to be elected, that requires money for its campaign, that becomes very problematic. So the truth is, the judicial reform will have a terrible impact in terms of how companies will be able to get justice in Mexico.
Yeah, just so people understand, because particularly Americans will say, well, gosh, in several states in the US, we elect judges, right? But when you go to the polls to vote, you might be voting for one or two judicial posts in your area. But when Mexicans go to vote on this, they're voting for federal judges. It's only federal judges now. So you literally, they haven't come up with a better system, but right now, you as the average voter will have to vote for about 500 judges. And so you can imagine, first of all, how on earth are you going to remember the names of 500 judges? How are you going to be able to make any kind of informed decision? Am I wrong in that assessment of how it will work on a sort of practical voter base?
So somewhat sinisterly, one of the proposals made by as of very recently, Secretary of Gobernación, Luisa María Alcalde, was that you'd get a sort of cheat sheet where sure, you've got 500 names, but on the back it says which one of the three powers, because this is how it's going to work, the three powers nominate the different candidates for judges. They filter them. So the judiciary gets a candidate list, the legislative gets a candidate list, and the executive gets a candidate list. So if you love the president in turn, you get your cheat sheet where they say, this is, if you like me, this is who you vote for. And so it takes away any agency from the actual judges. You're not voting for judges. It's just another referendum on the status quo at play.
Yeah, go ahead, Chris.
No, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say we have a question. I think you sort of answered it, but if we're talking about more industrial development in the South, will that attract organized crime? And I think you did mention this, but go ahead and answer that.
Organized crime has been moving southward, and seeing southern states of Mexico as a major piece in their arsenal through the AMLO presidency. And nowhere has that been more critical than Chiapas. Chiapas is the state, one of the poorest states in Mexico, right there on the Guatemala border. Essentially, that was Sinaloa cartel territory for many years. There was some, let's say, abuse of indigenous communities, but it was a state that saw a lot of migrant trafficking, cattle rustling, gun running, drug trafficking out from Guatemala, cocaine a lot of the time. About 2 years ago, that became, well, 3 years, became lucrative enough that the Jalisco cartel moved in, and overnight, Chiapas becomes one of the most violent states in Mexico. Tens of thousands of people displaced, forcibly recruited, a lot of Guatemalans, that's something we didn't talk about. The nature of a cartel in Mexico is becoming transnational, where a lot of the soldiers are now Guatemalan, Belizean, Venezuelan, Colombian, Salvadoran, and nowhere is that more present than in the South. So yes, while the violence was for a long time not confined, but majoritively in the North, sadly, southern states are no longer immune at all.
We've reached 3 hours. We've answered all the pending questions. Let's move one more slide, Vale. I want to point out to people. Sorry.
Could I just go back?
Question.
Could I have 1 minute?
Yeah, we're not concluding yet. We're going to talk about your newsletter in a sec.
Perfect. Sorry.
Or did we brush over that? Did we? I don't think so. I think it's on the next. So let's go to the next slide. Vale. Yeah. I want to give Chris, give us a little understanding of this newsletter and what this QR code will bring people to.
Apologies then for the misunderstanding there. Yeah, before we wrap up, so World of Crime has a newsletter called Seasons of Crime. It's where essentially all of World of Crime's research about how organized crime affects business and companies around the world. We look a lot at Latin America and different strategies, different technologies that are being put into place, different mitigation tools that can be done. But we also have seasons. So we look at the way that crime is beginning to use AI, for example, for scams on an industrial level, for extortion, the way that AI is used by police to go after organized crime. At the end of this year, we're having a season on the way that organized crime is now a major driver of climate change in Mexico, which might seem like a sort of highfalutin problem, but we do talk a lot about the corporate impact there. So we look at mining, we look at deforestation, we look at land use in Mexico through the lens of the interaction between organized crime and legitimate business. So if you give a scan to that QR code, it's a free newsletter, but hopefully I'll see your names there and we can interact.
Right. Thank you. Vale, let's go back a slide. Before everyone leaves, I want to ask you to answer this question again, to see if what you heard over the last 3 hours has perhaps modified your view of risk. So you'll see the question. We're going to ask you to answer it again. Perhaps you'll stick to your previous answers. Perhaps after hearing what we said over the last 3 hours, you may have a different view of risk. We'd love to see your answers here. Appreciate that. And again, I want to reiterate what Diego said. If you have additional questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us by email. If some of you have our phone numbers as well, and let us know. We'll answer them, or we'll direct you to the person who can. So want to thank everyone for staying through the 3 hours, for filling out these polls. And let's go ahead and share those results. As you can see, political interference still at the top. So not a big change. So we perhaps we've informed, but not necessarily changed your mind on risk. So we appreciate that. And just let's leave it at the last slide, where we have a link to AMI's thought leadership. So again, I think most of you are familiar with our firm. You're probably familiar with a lot of the things that we publish for free. Again, it's not what pays the bills, but it does keep us exposed and interesting to people. So again, we appreciate your time. Let us know how we did today. Let us know by email what you thought could have been improved or included that wasn't. All that kind of feedback would be very, very welcome. Thank you again. Thank you to my fellow panelists, Diego, Alex, Chris. Terrific job. Really appreciate your time today and all the effort that went into building this, and look forward to future collaborations.